Vivian Mercer walked into the Blackthorn Ranch kitchen on a Tuesday morning like she owned every inch of it. She didn't knock. She didn't wait. She pushed the door open with 2 fingers, let her eyes travel slow and deliberate across the room, the cast-iron pans hanging in clean rows, the flour dusted across the work table, the pot of broth sitting low on the fire, and then she looked at Mara Whitlock, the way a person looks at something they're about to throw out. "I don't know what you think you're doing here," Vivian said, her voice carrying that particular softness that meant she wanted it to cut. "But Colton Vance doesn't need a desperate ranch girl playing house in his kitchen. He needs someone who belongs in his world." She smiled. "And that, darling, is not you. It never will be." Mara set down her knife. She didn't say a word. But her hands were shaking, not from fear, and not from anger either, from something older and harder than both of those things combined. If you've ever stood in a room and felt someone try to make you feel worthless, and you had to decide in that moment whether to fold or hold, then you already know exactly what Mara Whitlock felt standing in that kitchen. Stay with this story. Subscribe to the channel and follow every part through to the end. Because what happens next will show you what one woman with nothing left to lose is truly capable of. Hit the like button. Drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. The morning her father died, Mara Whitlock was already awake. She had been awake since 3, the way she always was when something was wrong, and she couldn't name it yet. She'd lain in the narrow bed she'd slept in since childhood, listening to the house settle around her, listening to the dry Colorado wind push against the window glass, listening for something that would tell her today was different. Something in the air, something in the way the dark felt heavier than usual. She got up and went to check on him. He was gone before she reached the doorway. She could see it from the threshold, the stillness of him, the particular way a body lies when it no longer has to hold anything together. Her father, Samuel Whitlock, 53 years old, who had been working this land since before Mara could walk, who had coughed through 2 winters without complaint and told her each time that he was fine, that she worried too much, that the ranch was going to be just fine. He had not been fine, and neither had the ranch. Mara stood in that doorway for a long moment. She didn't cry, not right then. There was a list forming in her head already, the kind of list that builds itself when your body understands before your emotions catch up. That survival is now the immediate concern. Dr. Brother Burial Debs, the debts most of all. Her brother Danny found her in the kitchen an hour later, sitting at the table with the ledger open in front of her and a cup of coffee she hadn't touched. He was 20 years old and looked at still carrying the softness of a boy who hadn't yet been broken by enough hard things. He sat across from her and looked at the ledger without touching it. The way you look at an injury you don't want to make worse. "How bad?" he asked. Mara turned the ledger toward him. Danny looked at the numbers for a long time. She watched his face do what faces do when the ground shifts under them, the small tightening around the eyes, the jaw setting, the deliberate steadying that means a person is deciding whether to fall apart or not. He chose not to. She respected him for that. "The mortgage is 3 months behind," she said. "The feed bill, the vet bills from last spring, the seed loan from Henderson. It all comes due by October. It's August." Danny pushed the ledger back across the table. He got up and walked to the window and stood there with his back to her, looking out at the land that was technically still theirs, but only barely, and only for now. Mara watched him. She'd been watching him do this his whole life, take things in, go quiet, come back with something half-formed that he was convinced was a plan. "I heard something," he said finally. "Dan, just listen." He turned around. "Blackthorn Ranch. You know it?" Mara knew of it. Everyone in the county knew of it, 7,000 acres northeast of town. Cattle operation, owned by a man named Colton Vance, who was either 34 or 36, depending on who you asked, and had a reputation for being exacting and difficult, and not particularly interested in what other people thought about either of those qualities. She'd never met him. She'd seen him twice at the feed store, tall, dark-coated, hat pulled low, not the kind of man who invited conversation. "What about it?" she said. "They need a cook. Permanent cook, not seasonal. Their last one left in June, something about the hours, something about the pay. Anyway." Danny came back to the table and sat down. He wasn't quite looking at her. "The pay is $30 a month plus room and board. 6-month contract. That's enough to cover the mortgage and the Henderson loan and still have something left." The kitchen was very quiet. "You want me to go work as a cook?" Mara said. "At Colton Vance's ranch. I want us to keep this land." He looked at her then. "Mara, if we lose the ranch, I know what we lose. Then you know I'm not asking you to do something I want to ask you to do." His voice cracked slightly on the last word, and he pressed his mouth shut. And Mara looked at her brother, this boy, this man, this blood of hers, and understood that he had already been carrying this plan around for days, probably since before their father's last bad night, and he had been dreading saying it out loud. She looked down at the ledger. $30 a month. Room and board. 6 months. She thought about her mother's kitchen, the one she'd learned to cook in, the one that smelled like cinnamon and wood smoke, and something she'd never been able to name, but that meant safe. Her mother had died 8 years ago. The kitchen still smelled like her sometimes, on cold mornings when the stove had been burning long enough. "I'll write to them," Mara said. The reply came in 4 days. It was not warm. It was not unkind either, just precise, the way a contract is precise, listing the terms with no extra words. Cook for 20 men, 3 meals a day, 6 days a week. Sunday breakfast only. Kitchen duties included. Pay as Danny had described. Report by the 1st of September. At the bottom, in different handwriting, darker, heavier, was a single line. Expect to be tested. This kitchen is not a forgiving place. Mara folded the letter and put it in her coat pocket and went out to the garden and pulled weeds for an hour without saying anything to anyone. She thought about her mother's recipe box, the tin one with the latch that stuck. She'd been keeping it on the top shelf of the pantry since her mother died, taking it down sometimes, but not often, running her fingers over the cards inside without reading them, because reading them felt too close to something she wasn't ready to feel yet. She went inside and got the tin down and packed it in her traveling bag. Then she packed her good apron, the one without holes, and her knives, which were hers, and had been hers since she was 14 years old. And her mother had said that, "These are tools, not decorations. Treat them like tools, and they'll take care of you." She had one dress that could be called presentable. She packed that too. On the morning she left, Danny stood in the yard with his hat in his hands and looked like he might actually cry, which would have undone her, so she hugged him quickly and climbed up into the wagon without looking back. 6 months, she said. 6 months, he agreed. The road to Blackthorn Ranch was 40 miles of nothing, particularly gentle. Flat stretches of pale grass, 2 creek crossings, a long slow rise through scrub and rock before the land opened again into the wide valley where Vance's operation sat. Mara rode with the supply wagon driver, a quiet man named Otis, who had the weathered quality of someone who had spent 30 years outdoors and stopped noticing most things. He told her a few things without being asked. The cook before her had lasted 3 months. The one before that, too. The men were rough, but not cruel. The boss was, and here Otis paused and chose his words particular. Particular how? Mara asked. He likes things done right, Otis said. He doesn't explain what right is. He expects you to figure it out. Mara thought about that for a few miles. What happens when you don't figure it out? He doesn't yell, Otis said. That's the thing. He just looks at you. And then he tells you what he needs one time. And if it doesn't happen after that, you're done. He glanced at her sideways. 2 cooks before you got the look and figured they'd rather be anywhere else. I'm not going anywhere else, Mara said. Otis made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Blackthorn Ranch came into view in the late afternoon, and Mara's first impression was that it was bigger than she'd imagined, and in worse condition than she'd hoped. Not the land was impressive, wide and well-watered, and stocked with cattle that even from a distance looked healthy. But the buildings had the particular shabbiness of a place where someone was good at the important things and didn't spend attention on anything they considered secondary. The bunkhouse needed paint. The yard fencing had been mended so many times it looked like a patchwork quilt in wood and wire. The main house was solid enough but had nothing ornamental about it. No flowers, no window boxes, nothing that said anyone had tried to make it pleasant. The kitchen was in a separate building just off the main house, connected by a covered walkway. Mara climbed down from the wagon, walked to the kitchen door, and stepped inside. She stood there for a solid minute. It was not a disaster. It was something more specific than a disaster. It was a space that had been used hard by people who didn't care about it, and then abandoned abruptly by someone who cared even less on the way out. The floor was swept, but not clean. The stove needed degreasing. One of the shelving units had a broken support and was leaning at an angle that put everything on it at risk. 2 of the pans had warped bottoms from being put away still wet. The spice shelf was a confusion of unlabeled tins and half-empty jars with stuck lids. Mara took off her coat. She rolled up her sleeves. She found the cleaning rags and the lye soap, and she started at the top. She was still cleaning 2 hours later when the door opened. She'd expected Colton Vance to be imposing. She hadn't expected him to be quiet. He stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment, without announcing himself, just long enough that she became aware of him, the way you become aware of a shift in temperature. She turned from the shelf she was organizing and faced him directly, because her mother had always said the worst thing you could do when you were uncertain was to look away first. He was tall, lean in the way of men who work physically and don't think about it. His face was weathered and straight-lined and gave very little away. He looked around the kitchen the way he probably looked at everything, taking inventory, calculating, deciding. Then he looked at her. You're early, he said. I was told September 1st. It's September 1st. He glanced at the window where the sun was still up by an hour. I meant you started early, on the kitchen. It needed doing. A pause. He walked to the stove and ran 2 fingers along the surface she'd just cleaned. He looked at his fingers. They were clean. He said nothing about this, which she understood after what Otis had told her to be its own kind of comment. 22 men, he said, including myself. Breakfast at 5. Dinner at noon. Supper at 6. If it's not ready, they eat cold or they don't eat. Either way, that's on you. He looked at her steadily. I don't want a cook who can make something impressive once. I need someone consistent every day. That's what I do, Mara said. He considered her for a moment with the expression of someone who had heard that claim before and had learned not to decide anything about it immediately. There's a room for you above the supply barn. Otis will show you. Be ready at 4:30 tomorrow. He turned and left. Mara turned back to the shelf. She found that her hands were steady. She was surprised by that, and then she decided not to be. The first morning at Blackthorn Ranch, Mara Whitlock discovered 3 things in fast succession. The first was that the flour was almost gone. Whoever had been responsible for the supply order before she arrived had either forgotten or not cared, and there were perhaps 10 pounds of flour left in the bin, which was not enough to feed 22 men breakfast. The second was that the wood box beside the stove was empty. The third was that it was 4:45 in the morning, and there were men already moving in the yard outside. She did not panic. Panic was a luxury, and she had learned a long time ago that you did not spend what you didn't have. She took stock of what she did have. Eggs. Plenty of them. Someone had been keeping the hens, at least. A whole smoked ham hanging in the cold room. Dried beans that could be refried. Cornmeal a full sack. Large salt, a block of hard cheese. She went outside in the dark and found the woodpile herself. A ranch hand, she would later learn, was named Garrett, was coming out of the bunkhouse when he saw her wrestling the first armload of wood and stopped. You're the new cook? He said, yes. The wood's our job in the morning. Then do it faster next time. She kept walking. He stared after her. Then he got 3 other men, and they had the box full in 10 minutes. She didn't thank them, because it wasn't a favor, it was the job, but she noted who they were, and the next morning she made sure their tin mugs were filled first. Breakfast that day was scrambled eggs with ham and melted cheese, cornmeal cakes fried in lard, and coffee that was actually strong enough to mean something. Not impressive, not fancy, but hot and filling and consistent from the first plate to the last. The men ate without talking much, which she'd come to understand was how ranch hands ate. When the food was good enough, that conversation seemed beside the point. Colton Vance sat at the far end of the table. He ate everything on his plate. He did not compliment the food. He did not complain. He drank his coffee and looked over some papers, and when he was done, he got up and went out without looking back. Mara told herself this was fine. She told herself it 17 more times over the course of the morning. It was in the middle of the second week that she met Elsie. She knew a child lived on the property. She'd heard mention of Vance's daughter in town. Vague comments about the girl being quiet, being kept close to home, not being much of a presence anywhere. She hadn't encountered her yet. The girl apparently ate in the main house, not with the men, and she was not allowed in the kitchen during the morning rush. But on a Wednesday, around 2 in the afternoon when the kitchen was clean and supper prep hadn't started yet, Mara heard small footsteps outside the door. She waited. Nothing. She went to the door and opened it. The girl standing on the other side was 8 years old, small for her age with dark hair and eyes that were too old for her face. She was wearing a dress that had been pressed carefully but was 2 seasons too short. She looked at Mara the way children look at things they've decided to inspect, but haven't committed to yet. You're the cook, the girl said. Mara Whitlock. You're Elsie. How do you know my name? I know everyone on this ranch. That's my job. Elsie looked past her into the kitchen. What are you making? Nothing yet. I was about to start on the bread. A pause, calculated in the particular way that children calculate things when they want something and aren't sure whether they're allowed to want it. Can I watch? Mara stepped back from the door. Elsie came inside and climbed up onto the stool beside the work table without being invited, which Mara respected as a sign of character. She watched Mara measure the flour and the salt with the focused attention of someone filing information away for later. My father says the kitchen isn't a place for children, Elsie said. Your father isn't here. Elsie considered this. Why does bread have to rise? She asked. And just like that, in the middle of a hard week in a hard place, something in Mara's chest loosened just slightly. She started explaining, and the girl listened the way her mother had always listened completely, asking questions at exactly the right moments, touching the dough when Mara said she could, and being careful about it. By the time supper prep needed to start, Elsie had learned how to tell when the dough had risen enough, and Mara had learned that the girl's mother had been dead for 4 years, and that Elsie ate every meal alone in the main house, and that she had exactly one friend, a girl in town she was allowed to see once a month. Mara didn't say anything about any of that. She just handed Elsie a small ball of extra dough and showed her how to braid it. The girl left with a small braided roll in her hands and came back the next day at the same time. Vivian Mercer arrived at Blackthorn Ranch on a Friday, which Mara would later think of as the day the real trouble started. She arrived in a buggy with her own driver and a hat box, and a confidence that preceded her through the kitchen doorway like a weather system. Mara had heard of her. Everyone within 40 miles knew the Mercer name. Old money, cattle money, the kind of family that had been in the county long enough to believe the county owed them something. Vivian was 26, handsome in the particular way of women who have been told their whole lives that they are beautiful and have organized their personality accordingly. She came into the kitchen while Mara was in the middle of boning a chicken, not a quick task, not one that allowed you to set it down, and looked around the kitchen with the same assessing gaze she probably used on everything she intended to eventually own. "So you're the new cook," she said. Mara kept working. "Can I help you with something?" "I'm looking for Colton. We have a dinner engagement this evening." "I haven't seen Mr. Vance since noon." Vivian walked closer to the work table. She looked at the chicken, at the knife, at Mara's hands. She was trying, Mara understood, to read something in the way Mara moved, something that would tell her whether this woman was a threat or a convenience. "You're not what I expected," Vivian said. "Most things aren't," Mara said. Vivian's mouth did a small thing that wasn't quite a smile. "I hear you've been spending time with his daughter. She likes to learn how things work. It's not unusual for a child." "No," Vivian agreed in a tone that suggested she had a disagreement to file at a later time. "But it can be unusual for an employee to make herself so comfortable." She let the word sit there. Mara finished boning the chicken. She set down her knife, cleaned her hands on her apron, and looked at Vivian directly. "I'm here to cook," she said. "I'm going to be here until the end of my contract. Whatever else you're wondering about, you're welcome to take it up with Mr. Vance." Vivian looked at her for a long moment. Then she picked up her hat box and walked out. Mara picked up her knife. Her hands, she noticed, were not shaking, but there was something tight in her chest that hadn't been there before, the specific sensation of a problem you can see clearly but can't yet do anything about, one that is going to have to get worse before it can get better. She put the chicken in the pan. She started on the potatoes. She worked until supper was done, and the men were fed, and the kitchen was clean, and she could go to her room above the supply barn and lie on her narrow cot and stare at the ceiling and think about the 6 months she'd promised. 2 weeks down, 22 to go, she thought about Danny. She thought about the ledger with its blunt, honest numbers. She thought about her mother's tin recipe box sitting on the shelf above the stove where she'd put it the first day, keeping it there not because she needed it yet, but because she liked being able to see it. She thought about Elsie eating alone in that big house every night, cutting her own food with small, careful hands. She thought about what Vivian Mercer had said, the way she'd said it. Comfortable, like it was an accusation, like it was a warning. Mara closed her eyes. She told herself she was not comfortable. She was working. She was surviving. She was doing what she came here to do. But somewhere between that thought and sleep, she knew she was also slowly, reluctantly, despite every intention to remain detached, starting to care about this place, about these people, about a girl who braided dough and asked questions about yeast. That was the thing about being needed that nobody warned you about. You started to need the needing back. Mara pressed her palms flat against the mattress. It was Saturday. That meant beef stew for supper because it was the one night she allowed herself something that took all day, that had to be watched and stirred and coaxed into something that couldn't be rushed. She had a knack for it, her mother had said, for knowing when to add things and when to leave them alone. She fell asleep, trying to remember exactly how her mother had seasoned hers. In the kitchen below, the embers in the stove settled and cooled. The recipe tin sat on its shelf in the dark. Outside, the Colorado wind moved across the wide land of Blackthorn Ranch. The same wind that had moved across every piece of ground in this county for longer than anyone's memory, indifferent to contracts and debts and women who had come too far to consider turning back. The bread had been right. That was the thing Mara kept coming back to in the days after Vivian Mercer's visit, not the woman's careful eyes. Not the way she'd let the word comfortable hang in the air like a verdict, but the bread. The loaves she'd pulled from the oven that same evening had come out exactly as they should, golden, even crust interior that tore clean without being gummy. 22 men had eaten every last piece, and Garrett, who had barely said 3 words to her in 2 weeks, had asked if there was more. There wasn't. But the asking mattered. She had come here to do a job. The job was getting done. That was what she told herself every morning at 4:15 when the alarm she'd rigged from a tin cup and a length of wire woke her in the cold dark above the supply barn. She dressed without lighting the lamp because she'd learned after the first week that she could find everything she needed by feel, and that saving the lamp oil meant not having to account for it later. She went down the outside stairs in the dark, crossed the yard, and started the kitchen fire. This was the rhythm of Blackthorn Ranch, and Mara Whitlock had made it hers. By the end of September, she had solved most of the practical problems. She'd gotten the supply order organized, which required a conversation with Colton that lasted 11 minutes, and involved her presenting him with a written list of what was needed versus what had been ordered before her arrival. He'd looked at the list. He'd looked at her. He'd approved it without comment, which was as close to praise as she'd learned to expect from him. The warped pans were replaced. The broken shelving was fixed. She'd fixed it herself with a scrap of lumber from the barn, which had prompted another sideways look from Garrett and an eventual offer from one of the younger hands, a boy named Pete, to help with anything that needed hauling. She'd said yes to Pete's offer because there was no point in being proud about things that didn't matter. The thing about cooking for 22 working men was that it was not glamorous and it was not simple, and anyone who thought otherwise had never tried it. It was logistics, it was timing. It was understanding that if the noon meal was 15 minutes late, 20 men stood around in the yard getting cold and irritable and less useful for the afternoon's work, and that was on her. It was understanding that some men couldn't eat eggs and some couldn't eat onions, and that both of those facts had to be accommodated without making a separate production out of it, because 22 working men did not have time for separate productions. Mara learned all of this the way she learned most things, by watching and adjusting and not repeating mistakes. By the 4th week, she had a system. By the 5th, the system had a rhythm. By the 6th, she stopped having to think about the sequence of it and just did it, her hands moving through the familiar motions, while her mind sorted through the quieter questions. What was running low? What needed rotating in the cold room? Whether the weather was about to turn in a way that would change what the men needed from their meals. It was in that 6th week that Mei Lin found her. Mara had known there was a housekeeper. She'd been aware of an older woman she occasionally saw crossing the yard between the main house and the laundry shed, moving with the deliberate efficiency of someone who had done the same tasks in the same order for so long that she'd stopped registering the individual steps. They had not spoken directly. The kitchen and the main house, while connected, maintained their own separate routines, and Mara had been too focused on establishing hers to look beyond it. But on a Thursday morning, with the breakfast dishes done and 2 hours before noon prep needed to start, she was working through her mother's recipe tin, going through the cards one at a time, which she'd been avoiding, and had finally decided to stop avoiding when the door opened and the older woman came in without knocking. She was perhaps 60, perhaps older, with a face that had been weathered without being roughened, the kind of face that had been exposed to a great deal of difficulty and had made peace with the exposure. Her hair was pulled back tight. She was carrying 2 jars of something preserved, which she set on the work table without ceremony. "Persimmon jam," she said. "I made too much. You can use it for the cornbread if you want." Mara looked at the jars. "Thank you." The woman looked at the recipe cards spread across the table. She did not ask about them. She pulled out the stool where Elsie always sat and sat down on it with the ease of someone who had decided to stay for a while. "I'm Mei Lin," she said. "I know. I'm Mara, I know." She tilted her head at the recipe cards. "Your mother's?" Mara looked at the cards. "Yes." "She teach you to cook?" "She did." Mei Lin picked up one of the cards carefully, the way you pick up something that belongs to someone else. She read it. "Put it down, apple tart," she said. "Good recipe. Old style. Not many people still do the lard crust." "It's better with lard," Mara said. "Yes," Mei Lin agreed with the satisfaction of someone confirming a position they'd held for a long time. "It is." They talked for 2 hours. Or rather, Mei Lin talked and Mara listened, and then Mara talked and Mei Lin listened. And by the time noon prep genuinely needed to start, Mara had learned more about the actual workings of Blackthorn Ranch than she'd gathered in the previous 6 weeks. Not gossip. Mei Lin did not gossip, or if she did, it was the particular kind of gossip that communicated useful structural information rather than idle personal detail. She learned that Colton had been running the ranch alone since his wife Clara died of fever 4 years ago, that Elsie had stopped talking for almost 3 months after her mother died and had only gradually come back to herself, that Mei Lin had worked at Blackthorn since before Elsie was born and had been the one to keep the house together in the years when it had been threatening to come apart. "He's not a hard man," Mei Lin said near the end of their conversation. "He's a careful one. There's a difference." Mara thought about the way Colton looked at the clean stovetop and said nothing. "Is there? A hard man pushes until things break. A careful man is afraid of breaking things, so he doesn't push at all. Both are problems, different kinds." Mei Lin stood up. "You've been here 6 weeks. He's watched your work every day. He's noticed. He's never said so. I told you, he's careful." She picked up her apron strings with a businesslike tug. "Elsie likes you." "I like her," Mara said simply. Mei Lin looked at her for a moment with the measuring look of someone who has learned to be careful about taking things at face value. Then she nodded once and went back to the main house. Mara stood in the kitchen for a moment after she left. She picked up the persimmon jam. It was good work, the jars were sealed well. The color was right. She put them on the shelf and went back to noon prep. The trouble started quietly, the way most trouble does. It began with a comment she didn't hear something said between two of the older hands after supper one evening, overheard by Pete and relayed to her the next morning, with the specific discomfort of someone delivering information they wish they didn't have to deliver. Garrett says some of the men are talking, Pete told her, studying the middle distance. He was 22, earnest in the way of someone who hadn't yet had it knocked out of him. About you and Mr. Vance, Mara kept chopping, saying what? That Pete stopped. Started again. That you've been putting yourself in the way of his daughter on purpose, to get close to him. The knife came down clean through the onion. She set it down and turned to face Pete, who looked like he was regretting being the messenger. Who's saying that? Garrett, mostly, and Holt. You know Holt, the big one with the red? I know who Holt is, Pete nodded. It's just talk, he said, with the hopefulness of someone who wants very much for something to be just talk. Mara picked up the knife again. Thank you for telling me. Mara, thank you, Pete. He left. She kept chopping. She finished the onions, started on the carrots, moved to the potatoes, and worked through the entire noon prep without stopping. Not because she was fine. Because stopping would not have helped anything, and she had learned a long time ago that there were feelings that had to wait their turn. She thought about Vivian Mercer's careful eyes. The way she'd left that first day without quite finishing whatever she'd come to say. The way a woman like that, with that kind of money and that kind of family behind her, would handle competition not directly, never directly, but through the particular alchemy of suggestion. A word here, an implication there, nothing you could point to or disprove, just a slow fog of rumor that settled over everything and changed the color of it, putting herself in the way of his daughter. Mara thought about Elsie sitting on the stool with flour on her hands, learning how to tell when dough had risen enough by pressing 2 fingers into it and watching what the indentation did. Thought about the way the girl lit up when something she'd done in the kitchen worked out. Right, not the desperate need for praise you sometimes saw in lonely children, but something more genuine than that. The simple satisfaction of competence, of having made something real. Mara was not going to let Vivian Mercer turn that into something dirty. The direct confrontation, when it came, was not the one she'd expected. She had expected Garrett. Garrett was the kind of man who said things behind your back and then couldn't quite meet your eyes in the morning. She'd known men like him her whole life, men who mistook cruelty for honesty. She'd been watching him all week, waiting for whatever was building in him to surface. What she hadn't anticipated was Holt. Holt was a large man in the particular way of men, who have been large their entire lives and have organized their understanding of the world around that fact. He was not unintelligent, but he was confident in a way that had probably never been seriously challenged. And that kind of unchallenged confidence has a tendency to become its own kind of stupidity over time. He came into the kitchen on a Sunday afternoon. Mara was alone. Pete was at the bunkhouse. Elsie hadn't come today because it was Sunday. And Colton kept Sundays different. Holt came in without knocking, the way he probably entered most spaces, with the assumption that his entry was self-justifying. Need to talk to you, he said. Mara was rendering lard. It was a task that required attention and didn't benefit from interruption, but she kept her eyes on the pan and said, I'm listening. This thing with Elsie, he said. It's got to stop. She stirred. What thing? You know what thing? Coming in here, making yourself all cozy with the boss's kid. He crossed his arms. We've seen this play before. Women who figure out the shortest route. Mara set down the spoon. She turned around. She looked at him the way her mother had taught her, to look at things that needed to be taken seriously completely, without flinching, without anger either, because anger gave people something to dismiss. You want to explain what you mean by that, she said. It was not a question. I mean, you're not here to be a mother to that girl. You're here to cook. And there are people wondering why you've been making yourself so necessary, and whether Vance knows what kind of woman he's got on his property. The kitchen was very quiet for a moment. What kind of woman, Mara said. A calculating one. She didn't move. She did not raise her voice. She said, the girl was eating alone every day and asking questions about how things work. I let her watch. I taught her some things. That's the whole of it. She looked at Holt steadily. If you've got a problem with a woman doing her job without apologizing for it, that's something you'll have to work through on your own time. Holt's jaw tightened. Don't get smart. I'm not getting smart, Mara said. I'm being exact. There's a difference. She turned back to the lard. I've got work to do. You should probably go. He didn't move immediately. She could feel him deciding whether to push it further, calculating the way men like Holt, calculated whether she was the kind of woman who could be made to back down by being loomed at. Then she heard his boots on the floor and the door opened and closed. She stood very still for a moment after he left. Her hands were not shaking, but her heart was going too fast, and she had to breathe deliberately for a few seconds before she could trust herself to go back to the lard without burning it. She did not know that Colton Vance had been crossing the yard when Holt came out of the kitchen. She did not know this because no one told her directly. She found out the way you found out most things on a ranch, obliquely, through the accumulation of small observations. Pete had a particular expression the following morning, too carefully neutral. Garrett stopped meeting her eyes entirely, which was different from his usual pattern of almost not quite doing it. Two of the other hands, men she'd barely spoken to in 7 weeks, suddenly said good morning when she brought coffee out at 5:30, which they had never done before. The telling moment came at noon on Monday. Colton came into the kitchen while she was plating the food, which he did occasionally, usually to give her information she needed about the afternoon schedule, or to let her know that he'd be eating in town. He came in and he looked at her in that careful way of his, and then he said, without preamble, "Holt and Garrett won't be eating here anymore." Mara looked at him. "They're fired?" "I don't keep men who talk about other people's character in terms I wouldn't use myself," Colton said. She put a plate on the stack. "You heard? I heard enough." He paused. Something moved briefly across his face, not the calculated look she was used to from him, but something that had more effort behind it. "What they said was wrong. I should have dealt with the rumors earlier." Mara looked at him for a moment. "It would have been harder to deal with earlier," she said. "You didn't have cause yet." He seemed to consider this.
How are you managing?
"Fine," she said, automatically. And then, because something about the directness of the question didn't allow for a deflection, she added, "It's not the first time someone's assumed the worst. That doesn't make it acceptable." "No," she agreed, "but it makes it familiar." He looked at her steadily, with that look that she'd stopped finding unreadable and had started to understand as the expression of someone who was paying very careful attention. "The work you've done here in this kitchen, it's been more than what was asked. It's what the job required. The last 2 people in this job didn't see it that way. I'm not the last 2 people." A pause. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, but the nearest thing to one she'd seen from him. "No," he said, "you're not." He picked up his plate and left. Mara stood in the kitchen and felt something she couldn't name settle in her chest. Not warmth, exactly. Not triumph. Something quieter, the particular sensation of being seen by someone who looked carefully. She told herself it was satisfaction, professional satisfaction. The job acknowledged by the employer. She believed this for approximately 4 days. The afternoon that changed things between her and Elsie happened in the first week of October, when the weather had shifted from the dry warmth of September into something with an edge. Elsie came to the kitchen at the usual time, but she was different that day, quieter than usual. Not the focused quiet of a concentrating, but the heavier quiet of a child carrying something they haven't found words for yet. She climbed onto her stool and watched Mara work without asking a single question, which in itself told Mara everything she needed to know. She let it sit for a while. She finished the pie crusts she was making, pressing them into the tins with the heel of her hand, the way her mother had shown her, and then she said, without looking up, "You want to tell me what happened?" "Silence, or not," Mara added. "Both are fine." The silence stretched for another full minute. Mara lined the crusts up on the shelf. She started on the apple, peeling, coring, slicing, the rhythm of it a thing she could do while giving her full attention to the room. "Miss Vivian came today," Elsie said finally. Mara kept slicing. "She brought my father flowers." She sat in the parlor and talked to him for a long time. Elsie's voice was perfectly level in the way that children's voices are perfectly level when they are working very hard to control them. "And when my father left to go check something in the barn, she looked at me and said I should be happy, that I was going to have a real mother soon." The knife went down on the cutting board. Mara turned. Elsie was looking at the work table. Her jaw was set, and her eyes were bright, and her hands were clasped in her lap in the particular way of a child who has decided that crying would be losing. "She said that to you," Mara said. She smiled when she said it. Elsie's voice went flat on the word smiled, and in the flatness of it was something that Mara recognized, the sound of a child who has learned earlier than she should have that some adults are careless with power. Mara came around the work table and stood beside her. She didn't hug her. Elsie was not a child who responded to being hugged by adults. She was still figuring out she held herself too carefully for that. So instead, Mara just stood beside her and said, "Vivian Mercer doesn't get to decide what you need." Elsie looked up at her. "And she doesn't know the first thing about what you have or what you're missing." Mara put a peeled apple and the coring tool on the table in front of her. "Your mother was real. Nobody replaces that. Anyone who tells you different isn't paying attention." Elsie looked at the apple. She picked up the coring tool. Do you think my father likes her? She asked. Mara thought about how to answer this. She thought about Colton Vance's careful face, his careful silences, the way he looked at things and gave nothing away. I think your father is a grown man making his own choices, she said, and that's something you have to let him do. Even if it's the wrong choice, even then, she paused. But I don't think he's made any choices yet. I think people are doing a lot of assuming. Elsie cored the apple. She was getting good at it. She'd learned to angle the tool correctly so the core came out clean. She set the cored apple down and started on another one, and the kitchen filled with the sound of small, efficient work, and eventually the tightness in Elsie's shoulders came down by a degree. Mara, she said after a while. Yeah. Do you have to leave when your contract is done? The question sat in the kitchen between them. Mara looked at the apples. She thought about Danny and the ledger and the ranch she'd grown up on, which was technically still there but would not be the same place she'd left, because places never were. She thought about the recipe tin on the shelf and the persimmon jam Mei Lin had left, and the particular silence of early morning, when the kitchen fire was just starting and the world was dark and manageable. I don't know yet, she said. It was the most honest answer she had. Elsie accepted it with the gravity of a child who understands that honest uncertainty is better than comfortable lies. November came in cold and stayed that way. With the cold came more work. The woodbox needed filling twice a day. The cold room needed monitoring more carefully. The men needed more from their meals, the kind of caloric heft that only comes from things cooked long and slow. Mara adjusted. She started a ham and bean pot every Friday that carried through to Saturday. She learned which of the men were struggling with the cold. There were 2 who had come from warmer climates and had not quite adapted, and she started making sure their coffee was not just hot, but made in a way that would hold the heat longer. She noticed she was doing this without thinking about it as anything other than the job. She noticed it was becoming harder to maintain the internal position, that the job was what she was here for, and nothing else. She was in the kitchen on a Wednesday afternoon, in late November, when Mei Lin came in and sat down without being invited, which meant it was not a casual visit. Vivian Mercer has been talking in town, Mei Lin said. Mara looked up. About you. Mei Lin folded her hands on the table. About how you've been making yourself indispensable on purpose. How you've gotten the child attached to you. How Colton is too proud to see what's happening under his own roof. She paused. She's telling people that you came here without prospects. That this is the oldest play there is. Mara was quiet. It's getting traction, Mei Lin said. People in town who've never met you are repeating it. The way things do in Mr. Vance? He's heard. He hasn't said anything. Mei Lin looked at her steadily. He doesn't know what to do with it, which is a problem. Colton Vance knows exactly what to do with a sick cow or a broken fence line. He doesn't know what to do with a story that's partly about him. Mara sat down across from her. What do you think I should do? It was not a question she asked easily. She was not good at asking for help. She'd been raised in a household where help was something you gave other people when you had something to spare, which was not often. But Mei Lin was a woman who had seen a great deal more of the particular kind of trouble that follows women around, and Mara understood that pride was not the right tool for this situation. Mei Lin thought for a moment. Do your job, she said. Better than anyone can reasonably expect. Don't give the story anything to feed on. I've been doing that, I know. Mei Lin met her eyes. What I mean is don't stop, even when you want to, even when it feels like it's not enough. She paused. There will be a moment when what you've built here will have to speak for itself. The work you do, the way the men have come around, the way that child has come back to herself. That's not nothing, that's real. Real doesn't always win, Mara said. No, Mei Lin agreed. But it stays, that's more than rumors do. Mara looked at the table for a moment. She thought about her mother, who had been a woman who worked hard and didn't complain about working hard, and had built a life that was modest and real, and was now held together by nothing but Mara's own determination. She thought about what her mother would have said about this situation, and she knew it would have been something short and practical, and slightly irritable, and completely correct. Do the work, Mara. The rest will sort itself out, or it won't. But the work is the part you control. She looked up at Mei Lin. Will you teach me something? She said. Something from your own cooking. Something that isn't in anyone's recipe box. Mei Lin looked at her for a moment. Then she got up and went to the spice shelf. She came back with 3 tins and set them on the table. Move over, she said. I'm going to show you how to make a spice blend that'll change what you do with anything you put it on. And you're going to pay attention. Mara moved over. She paid attention. Outside, the November wind pushed at the kitchen walls. The stove made its low sound. Somewhere in the main house, Elsie was probably at her lessons, sitting at the table with her chin in her hand, working through whatever the day required of her. Mara thought, I am still here. I have not run. And I am learning something new. For now, that had to be enough. For now, it was. The bunkhouse confrontation came on the last Saturday of November, and Mara had not planned it and was not prepared for it, and handled it imperfectly, which was the only honest way to describe what happened. She had been delivering the noon meal, which she sometimes did herself on Saturdays, when Pete was off on other tasks, and she'd heard the voices before she reached the door. Not anger exactly. Something between mockery and the casual cruelty of men who believe they are among their own kind. She heard her name. She heard the word scheme. She heard Garrett's voice, which surprised her because she'd thought Garrett was done after Colton had dealt with him, but apparently being called out by the boss had not changed what Garrett thought, only what Garrett said out loud in places where he thought it could be heard. She pushed the door open. The bunkhouse went quiet the way rooms go quiet when the person being discussed walks in. There were 7 men. Garrett and Holt were among them, which meant they were eating in the bunkhouse today instead of at the table, which was their prerogative. The other 5 men were ranch hands she cooked for every day. She set the tray down on the table. She looked at Garrett. "I heard you," she said. "Not all of it. Enough." Garrett had the grace to look uncomfortable. "Now look, I'm going to say one thing," she said. "One time. And then I'm going to go back to the kitchen, and that's going to be the end of it." She looked at the room, not just at Garrett, at all of them, the ones who'd been talking, and the ones who'd just been listening. "I came here to do a job. I have done that job every single day without asking for anything except what's in my contract. I have not asked for special treatment. I have not tried to make myself anyone's problem or anyone's priority." She paused. "I am teaching a lonely little girl how to make bread because someone should. That is the full extent of whatever story you've been telling about me. And if you can look at that and see something shameful, the problem is not with what I've been doing." The room was very still. "I don't need your approval," she said. "I need you to eat your noon meal and go back to work." She left. She made it back to the kitchen before her knees did that unsteady thing, and she stood at the work table with both hands flat on the surface and breathed until she was certain she was fine. 3 minutes later, Pete appeared in the doorway. "The men are saying you walked in there like you owned it," he said, with a carefully suppressed grin. "I didn't own it," Mara said. "I just didn't pretend it wasn't mine to enter." Pete shook his head slowly. He came in and started helping her with the dishes without being asked, which was not his job and which she accepted without comment. What she did not know, what she would not learn until later, was that Colton Vance had been walking past the bunkhouse when she'd gone in, that he'd stood outside the door for the full minute it had taken her to say what she'd said, that he'd stood there a little while longer after the door closed and she'd walked away. She did not know this, but Mei Lin did, and Mei Lin, who did not gossip but who understood perfectly well that some information needed to travel, made sure that Mara knew it before the end of the day. Mara thought about it that night in her room above the supply barn. She thought about what it meant and what it didn't mean, and she made herself very careful about the line between those two things, because she was not a woman who confused being witnessed with being wanted, and she was not going to start now. She was here for 6 months. She had kept the ledger in her head how much of the mortgage it would cover, how much would be left, what Danny might need to do differently once she had the money to send him. She was here to do a job. But her mother's recipe tin was on the shelf in the kitchen, and it had been there long enough now that she'd stopped thinking of it as temporary, and that she understood was either the beginning of something or the thing that would eventually break her, and she didn't know yet which one it was going to be. She lay in the dark and listened to the wind outside, and somewhere between one thought and the next, she fell asleep with the question still unanswered, and the December cold already moving in from the north, pressing at every wall of Blackthorn Ranch like something that intended to stay. December came the way it always did in that part of Colorado, not gradually, not with warning, but all at once like a door slamming shut on everything that had come before it. The ground froze hard in the first week. The creek that ran along the eastern pasture iced over at the edges, and by mid-month was solid enough that the cattle had to be redirected to the water troughs twice daily, which meant more work for the hands, and a particular kind of tired that settled into men's faces, by supper time the exhausted, slightly hollow look of people working in cold that doesn't let up. Mara responded to this the way she responded to most things she could actually control. She adjusted the food. More fat, more warmth, more of the things that took a long time to make and tasted like they had. The bean pots ran longer. She started making a corn and pork stew on Tuesdays that the men had started calling by a name she pretended not to hear because it was slightly indecent. And also, she had to admit to herself in the privacy of her own kitchen, genuinely funny. The ranch had settled into her. That was the only way she could describe it. Not that she'd settled into the ranch, but the reverse, as if the place had been slowly adjusting itself around her presence, the way a house adjusts to the weight of the people living in it. She knew the sounds now. the particular groan of the supply barn door in cold weather, the way the wind came from the northwest when a real storm was building, and from the north when it was just passing through. She knew which boards on the covered walkway, between the kitchen and the main house, would be iced over in the morning before she stepped on them. She knew Elsie's moods before the girl opened the kitchen door, could tell from the sound of her footsteps whether she was coming in eager or quiet, whether today was a day for learning something new, or a day for sitting on the stool and doing something simple and not talking much. She'd stopped second-guessing this knowledge. It was just what happened when you paid attention to people for long enough. Mei Lin had been teaching her in the afternoons, on the days when afternoon prep was manageable. Not formally, Mei Lin was not a formal teacher. She cooked alongside you and talked about what she was doing and expected you to keep up. And if you asked a stupid question, she would look at you briefly and then answer it anyway, which was, Mara had come to understand the highest form of respect Mei Lin offered. She was teaching Mara a particular approach to spice, not just what to use but when and how, the logic behind the combinations, the way you built layers of flavor that didn't announce themselves all at once but accumulated. It was, Mara understood, a way of cooking that required patience of a very specific kind. Not the patience of waiting, but the patience of trusting. She was in the middle of one of these afternoon sessions in the second week of December, when Mei Lin set down her spoon and said, without looking up from the pot, Victor Mercer is coming to the ranch. Mara looked at her. When? Friday, he sent word this morning. Mei Lin stirred. Colton told me. Victor Mercer, Vivian's father. Maras had seen him once from across the street in town, a large man, physically imposing in the way of men who have spent their whole lives with enough money to be physically imposing without consequence. He had a face that suggested he was accustomed to conversations ending the way he preferred. What does he want? Mara asked. What do you think? Mei Lin said. The pot simmered between them. Mara looked at it. She thought about the rumors that had been building since November. She knew they'd been building, because Pete still had that particular expression sometimes when he came into the kitchen, the expression of someone who'd heard something and wasn't going to say it. And because Otis, who told her nothing, had one morning said, without preamble or context, people in town are running their mouths about you, just so you know. Don't let it surprise you when it lands. It was going to land Friday. She picked up her own spoon. I'll make sure the kitchen is in order, she said. Mei Lin looked at her for a moment. Yes, she said. Do that. Victor Mercer arrived at Blackthorn Ranch on a Friday morning at 10 o'clock, which was not a time anyone visited a working ranch unless they were making a point about who had to stop what they were doing to receive them. He came with 3 men on horseback, and Vivian beside him in the carriage, which Mara saw from the kitchen window while she was rolling pie dough. She watched them come up the drive. She watched Colton come out of the main house to meet them, his hat on, his coat buttoned, his face doing nothing particular. She turned back to the dough. She had a pie to finish and noon meal to start, and the kitchen was warm, and had a smell she'd worked for 3 months to build into it, the accumulated residue of good food made consistently and without waste. She told herself she had no reason to leave the kitchen, that whatever was happening in the yard was not her concern, that her job was the kitchen, and the kitchen was fine and she was going to stay in it. She made it 11 minutes, not because she was afraid, because she heard Elsie's voice high and thin through the kitchen wall, and then she heard it cut off abruptly, the way a voice cuts off when an adult says something that silences a child. That was the sound that moved her feet. She came out of the kitchen onto the covered walkway and stopped. Victor Mercer was standing in the yard with his 3 men ranged behind him. Vivian was slightly to the side, wearing a coat that probably cost more than Mara's 6-month contract. Colton was facing them. Elsie was standing beside Colton with her hand in his, which she rarely did. Elsie was not generally a child who reached for her father's hand in public, which told Mara everything about how the previous 10 minutes had gone. Victor Mercer was a big man with a voice that knew how to carry. I'm not here to make trouble, he was saying, in the particular tone of men who have made exactly the trouble they intended, and are now describing it differently. I'm here to have an honest conversation, man to man. Then have one, Colton said. The woman you've got in that kitchen. Mercer gestured toward the walkway without looking at it, and then his eyes landed on Mara standing there, and he recalibrated without missing a beat. Convenient. I won't have to describe her. He looked at Mara the way she'd been looked at a few times in her life, not with malice exactly, but with the flat assessment of someone who has already decided your value and found it insufficient. It was a look that was supposed to make you smaller. She'd always found it made her steadier instead. Miss Whitlock, he said. My daughter tells me you've made yourself quite at home here. I work here, Mara said. That's one way to put it. He looked back at Colton. The county's been talking about this woman for a month. I've heard it from people I trust. She came here without anything. She's attached herself to your daughter, and you're too busy running this operation to see what's happening in your own house. Colton looked at him without expression. What do you think is happening in my house? A woman without prospects, Mercer said flatly, making herself necessary to a man who's been alone too long. It's not complicated, Vance. It's just not something you want to look at. The yard was very still. The three men behind Mercer hadn't moved. Elsie had gone rigid beside her father, small and tight and furious in the way of children who understand they are being used as an argument in a conversation that has nothing to do with them. Colton said, "You rode 40 miles to tell me that." "I rode 40 miles, Mercer said, because Vivian deserves better than being undermined in her own." "Vivian and I have had dinner twice," Colton said. "That's not an arrangement. That's not a commitment. And it's certainly not a reason to ride onto my property and speak about my employee the way you just did." Mercer's jaw tightened. "Colton, you're on my land," Colton said quietly. He was not loud. He never seemed to need to be. "I'm going to ask you to choose your next words carefully." The silence stretched. Mercer looked at Vivian, a look that meant something was being communicated. Some signal that Mara didn't have the context to fully read but understood was a pivot. Vivian stepped forward. She was composed perfectly so, in the way of someone who had prepared for this exact moment. "I'm not asking for anything unfair," Vivian said. Her voice was measured, almost gentle, which was worse than her father's bluntness. "I'm just suggesting that if this woman is what she says she is, a cook, just here to do her job, then she should have no objection to proving it in a context that doesn't involve Colton's house or his daughter." "Proving it how?" Mara said. Vivian looked at her for the first time. "The county cooking competition. March in Dalton. It's the biggest one in the region. Every cook worth anything enters." A small pause. "Or doesn't if they have something to hide." The yard was quiet again. Mara felt the shape of the trap clearly. Refuse, and the refusal becomes the story she was afraid. She knew she'd be found out. The rumors were right. Except, and she had 3 months to prepare for a public test in front of everyone who had already been told she was a fraud. She looked at Vivian Mercer's composed, patient face, at Victor Mercer's flat, certain eyes, at Colton, who was watching her with an expression she couldn't entirely read, but which did not look like he was about to speak for her. She looked at Elsie, who was watching her with an expression that was not hopeful and not afraid, but something more concentrated than either. A child waiting to see what an adult does when the problem is genuinely hard. Mara said, "I accept." Vivian's composure flickered just briefly, just for a fraction of a second, the way composure does when something happens slightly faster than expected. Then it was back in place. "Wonderful," she said. "We'll see you in March." Victor Mercer looked at Mara for one more long moment, reassessing in some way she couldn't fully track. Then he turned back to Colton. "I'll leave you to it," he said, with the magnanimity of a man who believes he has already won. He turned to his horse. They were gone in 10 minutes. The yard settled back into its ordinary sounds: wind, cattle in the far pasture, the creak of the barn. Elsie's hand loosened from Colton's. She turned and walked to Mara and stood directly in front of her, looking up. "Are you scared?" she asked. "A little," Mara said, because Elsie would have known if she'd said no. Elsie nodded slowly. "Okay," she said. Then she turned and walked back to the main house. Mara stood in the cold yard and thought about March. 3 months. She thought about everything she knew and everything she didn't know, and the gap between those two things, which was currently very large. Then she went back to the kitchen and finished the pie. Colton came into the kitchen that evening, after supper was done, and the men had gone back to the bunkhouse, and Mara was washing the last of the pots. He stood in the doorway for a moment, the way he sometimes did, giving her notice of himself, without demanding her attention. She didn't stop washing. She'd learned this was one of the ways they communicated, the small courtesies of people who were gradually figuring each other out. "You didn't have to accept," he said. "Yes, I did," she said. "I could have handled Mercer, I know that." She put a pot on the rack. "But it would have been your handling of him. It wouldn't have been mine." She turned around. He was leaning in the doorframe with his arms crossed, which was the most relaxed posture she'd ever seen him adopt. "If I let someone else fight this, it never really ends. There's always another Mercer who thinks he can ride in and say things about me and have them stick. And a cooking competition changes that. Winning one does." He looked at her steadily. "Do you think you can win?" It was a direct question. He always asked direct questions, which she'd come to appreciate in the way you appreciate a tool that does exactly what it's supposed to do, no more and no less. She thought about what she actually knew. Her mother's recipes, which were good and proven, and hers in the deepest sense of belonging. Mei Lin's teaching, which had been adding something to her cooking she hadn't had before, a complexity, a layering that she couldn't always name but could taste. The 6 months she'd spent cooking for 22 men every day, which had refined her instincts in ways that cooking for a small household never could. "I don't know," she said, "but I think I have a better chance than they're expecting." Something in his face shifted. "Not much, just enough." What do you need? She hadn't been expecting that question. She'd expected a nod, maybe an acknowledgement, the particular Colton Vance form of encouragement that consisted primarily of not discouraging. This was different. She thought about it honestly. Time in the afternoon, she said. An hour a day I can use for testing recipes. And Mei Lin, if she's willing. She knows things about flavor I'm still learning. The afternoon hour is yours, he said. I'll talk to Mei Lin. He pushed off the doorframe and turned to leave. He was almost to the yard when she said, "Thank you." He stopped. He didn't turn around, exactly, but he angled slightly, enough that she could see the line of his jaw. "You stood in my yard today in front of 3 men who came here to make you small," he said, "and you didn't flinch." A pause. "That's not nothing, Mara." He went out. She stood in the kitchen for a full minute without moving. Then she sat down, took out a piece of paper, and started making a list. The preparation was nothing like she'd imagined it would be, which was to say it was harder and stranger, and occasionally more satisfying than she'd expected all at once. She started with what she knew absolutely. Her mother's fried chicken recipe, which was the first recipe in the tin, and the one she could make in her sleep, the one she'd been making since she was 9 years old, and her mother had stood behind her and guided her hands through the sequence. The brine first, the chicken had to sit in it long enough, not so long it went soft. The flour mixture had to have the right ratio of salt and pepper and something else, something her mother had added that Mara had always done by feel rather than measurement. The oil temperature mattered more than people gave it credit for. She made it on a Thursday afternoon in the first week of January and brought a plate to Mei Lin and stood in the doorway of the main house kitchen while Mei Lin tasted it. Mei Lin chewed, she thought. She tasted again. She said, "But," Mara said, "the crust doesn't hold through the first 10 minutes after it comes out. By the time the judges taste it, it'll have softened in the middle." She set down the piece. "You need something in the coating that keeps the structure longer." Mara hadn't noticed this because she always served it hot and immediate. She thought about it. "Rice flour," she said slowly. "Mixed in, not replacing the wheat, just a portion," Mei Lin considered. "Maybe. Test it." She tested it 4 times over 2 weeks before she got the ratio right. The 5th version held the crust for 20 minutes, after coming off the heat not indefinitely, but long enough. She brought it to Mei Lin again, and this time Mei Lin ate most of the piece before setting it down, which was the closest thing to a standing ovation Mara was likely to get. The cornbread came easier. She'd been making it for the ranch every week. She knew the recipe's tolerances. She knew where the edges were. She added, a small amount of the persimmon jam worked into the batter itself, barely enough to identify, just enough to change the texture slightly and give it a warmth in the flavor that plain cornbread didn't have. She put honey in the crust wash. The result was something that tasted familiar and also slightly surprising. The way a song you know sounds different in a different key. The apple tart was the problem. She went through her mother's recipe 3 times, and each time it was correct but not exceptional. Not the kind of thing that won competitions. It was an honest apple tart, a good apple tart, the kind of thing a family was glad to have on the table. It was not the kind of thing that stopped a judge mid-bite and made them reach for a second piece. She knew it. She kept making it anyway, trying to find where the problem was. Too much cinnamon in some iterations, not enough lemon. The crust was consistently good. The lard crust she'd learned from her mother held up, flaky without being dry. But the filling kept not surprising her, and if it didn't surprise her, it wouldn't surprise anyone else. It was Elsie who found the answer. She'd been in the kitchen on a Saturday afternoon, watching Mara work through another version of the tart, perched on Ton's stool, asking the kind of questions that were both simpler and more pointed than adult questions. "Why does it always taste the same?" Elsie asked. "Because I keep making it the same," Mara said slightly irritably, because she was frustrated, and the irritation was honest. "Then make it different," Elsie said, with the magnificent simplicity of a child who has not yet learned that this is not always a useful observation. "Ow," Mara said, more curtly than she intended. Elsie was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Mei Lin puts something in her tea sometimes. I don't know what it is. It smells sharp." Warm Mara looked at her. "Cardamom? I don't know what that is." Mara was already moving to the spice shelf. She found the tin Mei Lin had given her in December, the one she'd been using on meat and on a spiced corn dish but had not thought to use on something sweet. She opened it, put it under her nose, thought about apple and lard crust, and the particular way sweetness, something that was not sweet to give it a place to be. She added a small amount to the apple filling. A 1/4 teaspoon, maybe slightly less. Not enough to identify. Not the first time you tasted it. Enough that something happened in the middle of the flavor that made you want to go back. She put the tart in the oven. She sat down on the opposite stool and looked at the oven. Elsie sat on her stool and looked at it too. "You'll have to wait," Mara said. "I know how to wait," Elsie said, with a dignity that was both slightly absurd and completely genuine. 40 minutes later, she pulled the tart out. She let it rest. She cut 2 pieces and put them on plates and handed one to Elsie and stood with her own plate and tasted it. She stood very still. It was right. Not perfect was not a word she trusted. Her mother had never used it. Mei Lin never used it, but right. It was the kind of right that meant she'd found the version of the thing that the thing was supposed to be. Well, Elsie said. Try it, Mara said. Elsie tried it. She chewed. She looked at the piece. She took another bite. Then she looked up at Mara with an expression that was entirely unguarded, a child's face with nothing complicated happening on it for once. Just the simple fact of something tasting good. That's the one, Elsie said. Yeah, Mara said. That's the one. January became February with the slow grinding quality of a Colorado winter that has decided to be thorough. The practice continued the ratio of rice flour in the chicken coating, the exact amount of honey on the cornbread crust, the cardamom measure in the tart that she now could do by smell alone. She made each dish so many times that she stopped thinking about the steps and started thinking only about the results, which was the place you had to get to before you could actually cook, as opposed to just following instructions. Mei Lin watched her progress with the particular satisfaction of a teacher who does not show satisfaction, because showing it might encourage complacency. Your hands are steadier than they were in November, she said one afternoon. I've been cooking every day, Mara said. That's not what I mean. Mei Lin put down her spoon and looked at Mara with that direct, unmanaged gaze. You were scared when you first came, not of the work, of something going wrong anyway, of doing everything right and it still not being enough. A pause. You're less scared now, Mara thought about this. I'm still scared. Of course you are. But you don't cook scared anymore. Mei Lin picked up her spoon again. That's the difference. It was true, Mara supposed. Something had shifted in the last 3 months that she couldn't entirely account for, not confidence exactly, which implied something about outcome, but a certain settledness with the doing itself. She cooked because she knew how to cook, and the cooking mattered, and the result of that was food that she could put in front of people without apology. Whatever happened at the competition in March, that remained true. She thought about this at 4:15 in the mornings when the alarm woke her, and she lay in the dark for 30 seconds before getting up. She'd stopped framing the getting up as discipline and started experiencing it as simply what she did. The kitchen was warm by 5. The coffee was done by 5:10. The men ate at 5:30 and worked and came back at noon and ate again and worked and came back at 6 and ate again. She was feeding people. Every day. People who were cold and tired and who needed the meals she made in a way that was practical and completely real. That was hers. That couldn't be rumored away. It was in the second week of February that she found out the full scope of the competition. Otis brought her the county notice on his way back from town, a printed broadsheet that listed the details with the cheerful, aggressive typography of official announcements that are trying to seem festive while communicating something that is not. The Dalton County Annual Cooking Competition, March 15th. 12 categories, 3 judges, prizes in each category. The overall prize, first place across all categories, by cumulative judge score, carried $50 in a county ribbon that Mara suspected was more valuable to the people in this county than the $50. Vivian Mercer was listed as a prior 2-time winner. Mara read this and said nothing and put the notice on the kitchen shelf. What she had not expected to see was the other names. Women from all over the county, some of whom she recognized from their reputations, a woman named Dorothea Haynes, who had apparently won the pie category 4 years running, a woman named Ruth Calder, who was famous in Dalton for a fried chicken that the broadsheet described, in breathless terms, as incomparable. Former winners, experienced competitors, women who cooked in front of crowds for sport as much as Mara cooked in a kitchen for survival. She looked at the names for a while, then she went back to work. Colton found her that evening going through the recipe tin for the 4th or 5th time, not because she needed anything in it, but because she found that handling the cards helped her think, the physical act of holding the things her mother had written, on settling something in her head. He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the tin and the cards spread out and said nothing for a moment. The names, he said finally, which told her Otis had shown him the broadsheet too. I saw them, she said. You're still going. Of course I'm still going. She looked up at him. Did you think I wasn't? He looked at her with that expression she'd learned over 4 months, the careful one, the one that was actually paying very close attention. No, he said slowly. I didn't think that. He looked at the recipe cards. Is there anything you need that you don't have? She looked at the cards. She thought about what she actually needed, which was not equipment or ingredients or time. What she needed was something that was already there, or it wasn't. No, she said. He nodded. He started to turn Colton. She surprised herself using his name. She'd mostly been careful about that, keeping the formality of Mr. Vance as a kind of distance she'd thought was appropriate. He turned. What made you hire a cook with a 6-month contract? She said. When the last two left before 3 months were up, he looked at her for a moment. She thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, "You wrote me back within 2 days." The other candidates took a week or 10 days, a pause. Someone answers that fast either really needs the work or really wants it. Either way, they'll try. "I really needed the work," she said. "I know," he said. "But you kept it after you stopped needing it to be desperate." He looked at her steadily. "That's not nothing either," he went out. Mara sat in the kitchen with the recipe cards and the lamp, and the sound of settling into its low evening burn. She picked up her mother's apple tart card. The handwriting was familiar as her own face, the slightly slanted letters, the place where her mother had used shorthand that only made sense if you already knew what it meant. She put the card back. She put the tin on the shelf. 3 weeks until March. 3 weeks until Dalton. She turned out the lamp. In the darkness, the kitchen smelled like everything she'd made in it over the past 4 months. The layered residue of a kitchen that had been used hard and taken seriously and treated like it mattered. She stood in the dark for a moment before going out. She thought about Elsie saying, "That's the one with her mouth still full of apple tart and cardamom." She thought about Mei Lin saying, "You don't cook scared anymore," and the particular quality of the silence that had followed, which was not empty but weighted. She thought about her mother's hands, showing her the same things she was now making under pressure, in front of strangers who expected her to fail. She went out into the February dark and crossed the yard to the supply barn and climbed the stairs to her room. Above her, the stars were very clear, the way they get when it's been cold, long enough that even the air has been cleaned out. She stopped at the top of the stairs and looked up for a moment. She was still here. She had not run. She had said, "I accept," in a yard full of people who expected her to say otherwise. March 15th was 3 weeks away, and she had work to do. The last 3 weeks before the competition had a quality Mara had not anticipated, not the panic she'd half expected, not the grinding dread of countdown, but something more like the particular clarity that comes when a decision has been fully made, and all that's left is the execution. She woke at 4:15, the same as always. She made breakfast the same as always. She fed 22 men and cleaned the kitchen, and in the afternoons she practiced, and in the evenings she went over the recipe cards, and the days moved through her the way days move through people who have stopped trying to manage time and are simply using it. Mei Lin came every other afternoon now. They did not talk about the competition directly. That was not how Mei Lin operated. She cooked beside Mara and said things about technique and said nothing about nerves, which was its own kind of help. She showed Mara a way of checking oil temperature without a thermometer that was more reliable than the thermometer, a skill passed down through so many hands that Mei Lin couldn't have said where it started. She showed her how to rest the chicken between the brine and the coating so the surface dried just enough, which affected the crust in a way Mara had been achieving by instinct and now understood by principle. "Knowing why something works," Mei Lin said, "means you can fix it when it doesn't." Mara wrote nothing down. She didn't need to. She cooked it until the knowledge lived in her hands. On the last Sunday before March 15th, she made all 3 dishes in sequence: the chicken, the cornbread, the apple tart, and timed herself and had Mei Lin and Elsie taste each one and say what they actually thought, not what was kind. Elsie was a reliable taster because she had not yet developed the adult tendency to soften honest opinions when they might cause discomfort. She ate the chicken and said it was good. She ate the cornbread and said the honey on top was very good, but the middle was slightly dry. Mara noted this. She ate the apple tart and closed her eyes for a moment, which was Elsie's highest form of endorsement. Mei Lin said the chicken was ready. She said the cornbread needed the batter slightly wetter on the next iteration, not by much, just enough. She said the tart was the best version Mara had made yet, and that the cardamom was correct and should not be adjusted. "Don't adjust it at the competition," Mei Lin said. "Not even slightly. Even if you're nervous and your instinct says to add more." "Don't. How will I know I'm nervous?" Mara said, and then heard how that sounded. That was a foolish question. "Yes," Mei Lin agreed pleasantly. Mara made the cornbread again that evening with the batter slightly wetter. She pulled it from the oven and cut a piece and stood at the work table and ate it and knew it was right. Not perfect. Right. The difference, as her mother had always said, was that right was achievable and perfect was an argument with reality. She put the recipe cards back in the tin. She put the tin on the shelf. She was ready or she wasn't. Either way, March 15th was in 6 days. The night before the competition, Colton knocked on the kitchen door at 8 o'clock. Mara had been putting the kitchen in order for the morning. Whoever managed the ranch breakfast in her absence, which Colton had arranged, would need everything accessible and clear. She opened the door and he was standing on the step with his hat in his hands, which was unusual. He generally kept his hat on unless he was inside, or the sun was down, and the sun had been down for 2 hours. "Come in," she said. He came in and stood just inside the door in the way of a man who has come with something to say and is deciding on the exact order of it. She went back to what she'd been doing because waiting for him, while he decided, felt like a pressure she didn't want to create. Otis will take you in the wagon, he said. 7 o'clock. The competition starts at 10, so you'll have time to set up. I know, he told me. The entry fee is paid. You didn't have to do that. It's a ranch matter, he said in a tone that didn't quite allow for argument. She let it go. He was quiet for a moment, and she stacked the clean pans and hung the heavy skillet on its hook and waited. Maylin and Elsie want to come, he said. I'm coming as well. If you'd rather, it's fine, she said. She turned around. It's more than fine, he looked at her. In the lamplight, the kitchen had a warmth that the February cold outside made sharper by contrast, the kind of warmth that exists in relation to what's outside it. He looked at her the way he'd been looking at her increasingly over the past several weeks, not the assessing look of an employer, not the careful look of a man managing his own uncertainty, but something that had let more of itself show. You've been here 5 months, he said. Almost 6. Your contract ends in 3 weeks. The kitchen was very quiet. She'd known this was coming. It was the conversation she'd been maintaining a careful distance from, the one she'd told herself she would address after the competition, when she knew what the answers actually were. Yes, she said. I want you to stay, he said. Not we need a cook or the ranch needs someone. He said, I want you to stay, which was a different sentence entirely, and they both knew it. She looked at him. She thought about all the honest things, the ones that were complicated and the ones that were simple. I need to get through tomorrow first, she said. Something in his expression settled, not disappointment, just acknowledgement. That's fair, he said. He turned and went out. She stood in the kitchen and listened to his boots cross the yard. She thought tomorrow. She put out the lamp. She went to her room. She lay in the dark and did not sleep for a long time. And when she finally did, it was the particular sleep of someone who has set down a weight they didn't know they were carrying. March 15th arrived gray and cold, the way spring arrived in Colorado apologetically, with no guarantees. Mara was up at 3:30 without the alarm. She dressed. She went down to the kitchen and made herself coffee and sat at the work table with her mother's apron in her lap. She'd taken it from the bag where she'd packed it on the day she left home. It was the one that was not her good apron, not the clean white one she used for presentation. It was her mother's actual working apron, the faded blue one with the burn mark at the left hip from a grease fire her mother had managed, without drama, 15 years ago, the one with the stain on the bib that had never entirely come out. She'd almost left it at home. It was impractical for a competition. She'd packed it anyway. She had her kit ready, her knives, her own small jars of the spice blend, and the cardamom, the rice flour she'd portioned out. The competition provided staples and equipment, but she'd learned enough to know that her own familiar tools mattered, that the difference between your knife and an unfamiliar one was minutes you didn't have to spare. At 6:30, Maylin came to the kitchen. She looked at Mara and at the apron and said nothing about either. She handed Mara a small parcel cloth tied with string. Open it after, she said. After what? After you win. She said it the way she said most things, flatly, as a statement of fact that did not require emotional support. Then she went back to the main house to get Elsie. They left at 7, Otis driving, Mara in the wagon bed with her kit, Colton on horseback alongside, Maylin and Elsie wrapped in blankets on the bench beside Otis. Elsie was quiet in the way she got when she was trying to manage excitement that she decided was undignified to show. She lasted 14 minutes before she scooted back to sit beside Mara in the wagon bed. Are you nervous? She asked. Extremely, Mara said. Elsie looked at the road ahead. You shouldn't be, she said, not as reassurance but as assessment. I've tasted everything you're making. It's better than anything I've tasted anywhere. You've been alive for 8 years, Mara said. Elsie appeared to consider whether this was a significant limitation. Maylin says so too, she said. And she's been alive a lot longer. Mara looked at the girl, her serious face, her old eyes, the specific dignity she carried that children who had been through real loss sometimes developed. She wanted to say something that was neither sentimental nor dismissive. She wanted to say something her mother might have said. Whatever happens today, she said, I want you to know that the cardamom was your idea. Elsie absorbed this with the satisfaction of someone receiving credit they are too proud to have asked for, but had clearly noticed wasn't coming. She turned back to the road. I know, she said. Dalton in mid-March had the concentrated energy of a county that did not have many occasions, and therefore treated the ones it had seriously. The competition hall was the largest public building in town, a wide wooden structure that on ordinary days hosted meetings and dances and the occasional legal proceeding, and that today had been transformed into something that smelled extraordinary, the accumulated air of 20-something kitchens, all operating simultaneously, all producing different things, all aiming at the same standard. Mara walked in and felt the size of it settle on her. There were stations set up in rows, each with its own stove and work table, identified by numbered cards. She found her station number 9, third row from the back, and began unpacking her kit with the systematic efficiency of someone who has learned that the time between arrival and the starting bell is not for nerves, it's for setup. She was doing this when she became aware of Vivian Mercer at station 4, 2 rows in front of her, and slightly to the left. Vivian was already organized, her station laid out with the kind of precision that suggested she'd done this many times and had a system. She had an assistant, which was apparently allowed, though Mara had not known this, and therefore did not have one who was aligning equipment while Vivian spoke to a woman beside her, a friend or relative, in a tone that didn't carry across the hall's noise. At one point Vivian looked up and their eyes met across the distance. She held the look for a beat, then looked away without expression. Mara turned back to her station. The hall filled. People came in around the edges, audience and observers, family members and curious townspeople. The particular crowd that gathers for competitions in small counties, where everyone knows everyone, and the politics of the event are therefore also the politics of the place. She didn't look for Colton or Mei Lin or Elsie. Looking for them would have taken attention she needed elsewhere. A man with a ribbon pinned to his lapel walked to the center of the hall and said things about the competition rules that Mara had already read and memorized. 3 judges, scoring on presentation, taste, and technique. 3 entries per competitor, in 3 categories: protein, bread or grain, and dessert. Judging in sequence, all stations evaluated in each category before moving to the next. At precisely 10 o'clock, he said, begin. The first 40 minutes were the chicken. This was the part she'd thought about most. The part with the most variables, the most ways for something to go sideways. Oil temperature wrong, coating not adhering. Timing off any of these would take the dish from good to mediocre in a way no amount of skill could recover from. She worked methodically through the sequence she'd practiced until it was a physical habit. Brine-rested chicken pieces, dried and ready, dipped in the flour and rice flour mixture she'd mixed at home and transported in her own jar into the oil at the temperature she could now verify with her fingertip without thinking. She did not look at other stations. This had been Mei Lin's most specific instruction. Do not watch what anyone else is doing. You know what your food needs. Watching other people creates doubt, and doubt changes your hands. The chicken went in. She monitored the temperature. She turned each piece at the interval she'd established over 40-something iterations of the dish. The crust came up golden at the right time, the color she'd learned to read as correctly done, and not just almost done, which was a different color that most people could not distinguish from this distance. She pulled the pieces at the right moment, set them on the rack, did not touch them again, let them do what they needed to do. The judges came to her station 9 minutes later. There were 3 of them, 2 men and a woman, all older, all carrying the particular expression of people who have tasted a great many things and are not easily moved. The woman picked up a piece of chicken and turned it over, looking at the crust from multiple angles before she bit into it. She chewed, she thought. She wrote something on her card. The first judge, an older man with a beard that had opinions of its own, bit into a second piece. He looked at the crust. He looked at his card. He looked at the chicken again. He wrote something. The third judge tasted and wrote without apparent expression. They moved on. Mara had no idea what any of them had written. She started on the cornbread. The cornbread was the dish she was least worried about, which paradoxically made her more careful with it, because overconfidence produced exactly the kind of careless errors that were hardest to recover from. She mixed the batter to the consistency she'd finalized after Elsie's feedback, slightly wetter than instinct said, held in exactly the proportion she'd arrived at in her last practice session. She worked the persimmon jam into the batter without overmixing, which was the thing about jam and batter that most people got wrong. They kept going after it was incorporated, working it into something uniform, when what you wanted was distribution, not homogeneity. She poured it into the cast iron she'd brought from the ranch kitchen. Her own pan, seasoned over months, nothing unfamiliar about the weight or the surface. She put it in the oven at the temperature she knew and stepped back. 7 minutes. She had 7 minutes. She used them to clean her workspace, to organize the kit for the tart, to stand still for a 30-second interval in which she allowed herself to think about nothing in particular and breathe normally. She'd learned this in the last few weeks of practice, that a brief stillness in the middle of a long effort was not laziness. It was management. Her mother had done it. She'd always thought it was her mother pausing to think. She understood now it was her mother choosing not to burn out before the work was done. At the 6.5-minute mark, she opened the oven and looked at the cornbread. The center still had a slight softness to it. She closed the oven. At 8 minutes, she looked again. She looked at the edges, the color. the way the top had pulled back very slightly from the pan. She pulled it. She brushed the honey wash on. Immediately it had to go on hot. That was the thing about it. The heat opened the crust surface so the honey didn't just sit on top but became part of the outer layer. She put the brush away. She did not touch the cornbread again. The judges came back. The woman tasted first again. She tasted a corner piece, which was Mara's strongest piece. The edges always got more of the honey, and then asked for a centerpiece, which told Mara she knew what she was doing. She tasted both. She wrote. The bearded judge ate most of his piece and then caught himself and set it down and wrote on his card. Mara noted this and said nothing about it. The third judge tasted and frowned slightly, not with displeasure. She'd come to understand, but concentration, and wrote something. They moved on. Mara started on the apple tart. This was the one. This was the dish she'd made most recently, and revised most thoroughly and understood most completely. The one that had gone from a competent thing to the thing it was supposed to be, in the moment she'd added the cardamom, and stood at the work table, and tasted it and gone still. She rolled the lard crust. With the rolling pin she'd brought from the ranch, she had not trusted a competition kitchen's rolling pin, which was probably sentimental and didn't matter because she'd brought her own. She worked the dough with the minimum contact necessary, because overworked lard crust was a specific kind of crime that she'd committed in her early versions and refused to repeat. She laid it in the tin. She trimmed the edge. She mixed the apple filling with the cinnamon and lemon and the cardamom measured by smell. The same smell she'd been calibrating for 3 months. The amount that changed the flavor without declaring itself. She poured the filling. She laid the top crust. She crimped the edge the way her mother had shown her, not elaborate, not decorative, just the plain, tight crimp that held and didn't unravel when the crust expanded. She cut the vents. She put it in the oven. She stood at her station and waited. Around her, the hall was in that compressed, concentrated state that happens when many people are working hard at the same time in close proximity. She could hear other ovens, other activity, other people's quiet focus. She did not look at Vivian's station. She looked at her own oven. 35 minutes. She checked at 25, not to pull it, just to look. The way you check on something you're responsible for, the way you look at a sick animal or a sleeping child, not to do anything but to know. The crust was coloring correctly, pale gold deepening toward amber at the crimped edge. She closed the oven. At 32 minutes, she pulled it. The crust was right. The vents had let the steam out at the correct rate. She could tell by the way the top crust had settled slightly back toward the filling, the particular architecture of a tart that had cooked through. She set it on the rack. She stood back. She had done everything she could do. The food was what it was now. The rest was not her work anymore. The judging of the tart happened 14 minutes later, and it was the only moment of the whole day that made her hands go slightly cold. The woman tasted first. She cut a clean slice from the tart, not a large one, a testing portion, and tasted it with the full attention of someone who is evaluating rather than eating, which was a different act and required different focus. She tasted. She was still for a moment, long enough that Mara noticed it. Then she tasted again from the same piece. She wrote. The bearded judge tasted. He set down his fork. He picked it up again and tasted again from the same slice. Mara's hands were cold. The third judge tasted and looked at the tart and said something quietly to the bearded judge that Mara could not hear. The bearded judge nodded. The third judge wrote on his card. They moved on. Mara breathed. There was an hour between the end of tasting and the announcement of results, an hour in which the judges conferred in a side room and the competitors and audience milled around the hall, eating the food that had already been judged, talking, waiting. Mara cleaned her station thoroughly because it was what she did when her hands needed something to do. She did not mingle. She accepted 2 compliments from women she didn't know without knowing how to respond to them, and probably said something awkward both times. Colton found her at the edge of the hall near the door. She hadn't seen him come in, which meant he'd been there for a while. He was standing slightly apart from the crowd, the way he always stood slightly apart from things, with his hat on and his coat buttoned, and that careful look that was also, she now understood, the look he wore when he was trying not to show that something mattered to him. Well, he said. I don't know, she said honestly. The judges were hard to read. The bearded one tasted your tart twice, he said. She looked at him. You were watching. I was standing right there, he said, with the particular expression of a man who has declined to admit that he positioned himself for exactly that view. He tasted it twice, he repeated. That means something. It could mean he wasn't sure, or it means he was sure and wanted to be surer. She looked at the hall. At the other competitors, some calm, some anxious, one woman near the food table eating from her own cornbread, with the resigned air of someone who had decided outcome was beyond her control, and food was at least reliable. At Vivian Mercer, who was standing with her father and 2 other people, and was composed in the way of someone who has experience managing the weight and has decided composure itself is a competitive act. "She's good," Mara said. "Vivian. She's an experienced competitor and she knows what she's doing." Colton looked across the hall. "Yes," he said. He looked back at Mara. "So are you." Elsie appeared from the crowd and inserted herself between them with the efficiency of a child who has been looking for someone for a while and is mildly annoyed at having had to look. "Mace Lynn says the tart smelled right from where she was standing," she informed Mara. "She says she could tell from the smell." May Lynn was in the audience. "She has a good nose," Elsie said with absolute confidence in this assessment. Mara looked down at her. The girl's face was flushed from the hall's warmth, and her braid had partially come undone, and she was looking up at Mara with that expression she'd had since the first day she'd walked into the kitchen and stood outside the door. Not quite committing yet, the expression of a child deciding whether to trust something. Only she had decided. She'd decided months ago in the way of children who decide things fully and then simply act as if the decision has always been the case. Mara reached over and tucked the loose end of Elsie's braid back into itself. It was not a significant gesture. Elsie let her do it without comment, which was its own significant thing. The announcement came at 2 in the afternoon. The man with the ribbon lapel pin came back to the center of the hall and said the things that were required before the results, and Mara stood with May Lynn and Elsie and Colton at the edge of the crowd and kept her breathing even. Third place overall went to Ruth Calder, who had apparently placed for the 4th consecutive year and received this information with the satisfaction of someone who had expected no less. Second place went to a woman named Agnes Pruitt from the north part of the county, who had not been on Mara's list of names from the broadsheet, which told her she hadn't done her research as thoroughly as she'd thought. The hall got quieter. The man with the ribbon said, "First place overall, across all 3 categories, by unanimous judge decision." Unanimous. Mara registered this word before she registered the name that followed it, Mayor Whitlock, Blackthorn Ranch. The hall was not silent. It filled with sound almost immediately, the complicated sound of a crowd that contains people with different feelings about a result. She heard approval, and she heard something that was not approval, and she heard Elsie make a sound beside her that was bitten back very quickly, but which she felt anyway. She walked to the center of the hall. The man with the ribbon handed her the county ribbon, wide, blue, the kind of thing that was neither elaborate nor cheap, and the envelope with the $50, and shook her hand and said things she heard without quite processing. She looked at the ribbon in her hand. She thought about her mother's apron, the one with the burn mark at the hip, which she was wearing. She thought unanimous. Then she looked up and Vivian Mercer was 6 feet away. This was not the moment Mara had imagined in the weeks when she'd let herself imagine it at all. She hadn't pictured the exact quality of the light in the hall or the particular expression on Vivian's face, which was not the fury she'd expected, but something more complicated, the face of someone who has organized a great deal of themselves around a certain understanding of the world and has just been asked to reorganize. Victor Mercer stood slightly behind his daughter. He looked at Mara with the same flat assessment he'd used in Blackthorn's yard, and in it she could see him recalculating, not apologizing, not yet, but revising the information. Vivian said, "Congratulations." The word came out correctly calibrated, not warm, but not the thing it could have been instead, which was worse. She said it because it was the thing that had to be said, and Mara respected that she said it and didn't make a scene of it, even as she understood that the effort it cost Vivian was not small. "Thank you," Mara said. Victor Mercer stepped forward. He was a large man, and he moved with the authority of someone who had spent 60 years being the largest and most certain person in most rooms. He said, "I'm told the judges called it unanimous." "That's what I was told," Mara said. He looked at her for a moment. "I misjudged the situation," he said. It was not an apology in any generous sense. It was a man acknowledging a factual error with the efficiency of someone who does not find acknowledgement pleasant, but has decided it is required. "I spoke about you in terms I would not use now. I know what you said," Mara said. "Yes." He held her gaze, which she gave back to him. "I was wrong." The words sat between them for a moment. Around them, the hall continued its noise and movement, the post-competition dissolution of a crowd that had already gotten the result, and was now processing it in their own ways. "I appreciate that," Mara said, because she did. Not because it fixed anything words said in a yard in December in front of 3 armed men were not undone by words said in a competition hall in March, but because he had said it directly and without elaborate construction, and she valued directness, even from people she had no reason to like. Victor Mercer nodded once tightly. He turned and walked toward the door. Vivian looked at Mara for one more moment. She opened her mouth, closed it. Then she said, "The cardamom in the tart. That was the thing, wasn't it?" "Yes," Mara said. "I wouldn't have thought of it," Vivian said. She said it's not as a compliment, and not as a concession, but as an honest thing. Then she turned and followed her father. Mara stood at the center of the hall and held the ribbon and the envelope and felt the day's accumulated weight settle into her, all at once, not triumphant, exactly. Something more like solid, grounded in the particular way of someone who has done a hard thing and come out the other side of it still themselves. Mei Lin reached her first. She looked at the ribbon briefly, then at Mara, and said, "Open the parcel." Mara had forgotten the parcel entirely. She found it in her coat pocket where she'd put it that morning. She untied the cloth. Inside was a small tin of Mei Lin's spice blend, not the practice supply, but a new tin, carefully packed and sealed. And inside the cloth wrapping, a card in Mei Lin's handwriting. "Now you know how it's made. Now make it yours." Mara looked at the tin. She looked at Mei Lin. Mei Lin looked back at her with the expression of someone who is done with this particular conversation and considers the matter settled. Then Elsie hit her from the side at roughly hip height, which was unexpected enough that Mara had to catch her balance, and the girl wrapped both arms around her and held on with the grip of a child who doesn't do this casually and is therefore not casual about it. Mara put her hand on Elsie's back. She didn't say anything. Neither did Elsie. The ride home was quieter than the ride in, the specific quiet of people who have been in a large crowded place for many hours and are grateful to be moving through open air. Otis drove. Mei Lin sat beside him with her hands folded and her eyes on the road. Elsie, who had been awake since before dawn and had maintained herself on determination for 6 hours, fell asleep against Mara's shoulder before they'd been on the road 20 minutes. Mara let her be there. Colton rode alongside on his horse for most of the way. Sometime in the last miles before Blackthorn came into view, he came alongside the wagon and matched the horse's pace to the wagon's and rode in silence for a while. Eventually he said, "Victor Mercer isn't a man who apologizes to many people." "I noticed," Mara said. "Did it matter?" The apology. She thought about it honestly, which was the way he asked things, and therefore the way she'd come to answer them. "Not as much as I thought it would," she said. "I thought winning would feel like something being corrected, like a balance settling." She looked at the road ahead. "It mostly feels like the thing being done, that's all." He was quiet for a moment, riding. "That's not nothing," he said, and she smiled a little because it was the same thing she'd told him, and he'd told her over the course of 5 months, back and forth, and had somehow become the language of this particular space between them. "No," she said, "it's not nothing." The ranch came into view in the late afternoon light, the main house, the bunkhouse, the kitchen building with the covered walkway, the barns and fences, and the wide cold land around everything. Mara looked at it coming toward her the way she'd looked at it the first time, with Otis driving and the ranch ahead and everything uncertain. It did not look uncertain now. She looked at Elsie sleeping against her shoulder. She looked at the recipe tin she'd carried home in her kit. She thought about Colton standing outside the kitchen door the night before, with his hat in his hands saying, "I want you to stay." And she thought about the answer she'd deferred to this side of today. She knew the answer. She had known it, probably, since the first Thursday afternoon, when Elsie climbed onto the stool without being invited, with the confidence of a child who had decided that this was a space worth entering. Since the morning she'd found the woodbox empty and gone out in the dark and handled it herself and not waited for anyone to tell her it was her job. Since Mei Lin had said, "You don't cook scared anymore," in a voice that made it sound like the simplest fact in the world. The wagon came through the gate. Otis pulled the horse to a stop in the yard. Elsie woke up immediately and completely, the way children do, looking around to confirm where she was, then settling back as if she hadn't moved. Mara climbed down from the wagon with her kit. She stood in the yard that was hers now in some real sense, that had nothing to do with property or contract. Colton dismounted and handed off the horse to Pete, who had come out of the bunkhouse at the sound of the wagon. He walked toward Mara. He stopped a few feet away. "Well," he said. "I'll stay," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Nothing dramatic happened in his face. Just the thing that happens sometimes, that small shift, the letting of something through that he kept back from most of the world. "Good," he said. It was a plain word. The right word. She was learning that with him the right word was almost always the plain one, and that this was not a limitation but a kind of precision. The same precision she used in cooking when she chose the amount that was correct over the amount that looked impressive. She picked up her kit. She walked to the kitchen. She opened the door and went inside, and it smelled the way it always smelled now, the accumulated evidence of 5 months of serious work, and she put her kit down and hung her mother's apron on the hook beside the door where it lived. She set Mei Lin's tin on the shelf beside her mother's recipe box. She stood and looked at both of them for a moment, the old and the new, side by side, which was the only way anything actually grew. Then she turned and started on supper, because the men were going to be hungry, and that was still her job, and she was glad for it. Supper that night was the best meal Mara had made since arriving at Blackthorn Ranch. Not because she tried to make it that way, She didn't think about it in those terms. She was tired from the day, the 4:30 wake-up, the 40-mile wagon ride, the 6 hours of sustained concentration in the competition hall, the weight of the result, and what came after it. And tired cooking is honest cooking, because you don't have the energy to perform anything. You just make the food. She made a beef and root vegetable braise that had been going in the low oven since Pete had put it on at noon, following the written instructions she'd left him. She made biscuits from scratch, because the ones Pete had apparently attempted were, by his own admission, and the physical evidence left in the pan, not a success. She made a gravy from the braising liquid that took 11 minutes and required nothing complicated. She put it all on the table at 6 o'clock, and the men ate the way men eat when they're genuinely hungry, and the food is genuinely good, which is to say quietly and completely. Nobody mentioned the competition directly. She knew they knew word moved on a ranch the way water moved, finding every level but the particular code of men who work outdoors for a living held, and what they offered, instead of direct acknowledgement, was cleaner plates than usual, and the absence of complaint, which was, she had come to understand, the sincerest form of appreciation available in this particular language. After supper, after the kitchen was clean, she sat at the work table for a while with the lamp low and Mei Lin's tin and her mother's recipe box side by side on the shelf in front of her. She was not thinking about anything in particular. She was just sitting in the room that had become hers, letting the day settle. She thought about the word unanimous and what it meant. Not what it meant for the result that was done. She understood it and had put it in its right-sized place, but what it meant about the past 5 months. All those mornings at 4:15, all the adjusted batches, all the evenings going over the cards. Mei Lin's particular way of teaching that demanded you keep up and never announced itself as teaching. Elsie's 8-year-old certainty about cardamom, delivered with the authority of someone who simply trusted their nose. The county ribbon was on the shelf beside the tins. She'd put it there when she came in and hadn't moved it. It was a plain thing, functional, the kind of object that stated a fact without making a speech about it. She looked at it for a while. Then she went to bed. Spring came to Blackthorn Ranch the way it always did, gradually, and then all at once, the frozen ground softening in the second week of April and the creek freeing up and the cattle moving differently in the pastures, the particular restless energy of animals who have been cold for months and are now warm and have opinions about it. The work on the ranch intensified with the season, the way ranch work always does in spring, more hands needed, more equipment moving, the planning and logistics of a whole year's operation clicking into motion all at once. Mara's contract had technically ended at the 1st of April. Neither she nor Colton acknowledged this formally. A new arrangement was made in the same way the old one had operated directly, with no extra words. $40 a month, which was 10 more than the contract, which she accepted without negotiation, because it was fair, and she knew the difference between fair and what she could theoretically extract from a situation. Room and board as before. Afternoon hours her own when prep allowed. The change was in the texture of things, not their structure. She was no longer counting months. She was not maintaining the internal distance she'd kept for the first 3 months, the deliberate positioning of herself as temporary, as someone passing through, as someone whose investment in this place had a defined endpoint. That positioning was gone. She hadn't removed it consciously. It had simply dissolved in the way things dissolve when they're no longer serving any function. She noticed this one morning in late April when she caught herself planning the summer menu with the same proprietary attention she'd once given to the kitchen itself, not just what to cook but what to grow, what to preserve, what to put up for winter. She'd spent an afternoon with Mei Lin discussing which herbs should go in the kitchen garden this year, and found herself with opinions that came from a sense of ownership she hadn't had to construct. It was just there. She mentioned this to no one. But Mei Lin noticed the way Mei Lin noticed most things and said nothing about it, which was also the way Mei Lin handled most things. Danny came in May. She'd written to him after the competition. Not a long letter. She was not a woman who wrote long letters, but an honest one. She'd told him the debts were paid, that she was staying on, that the ranch was good, and she wanted him to come see it when he could. She'd expected to wait through the summer. Instead, he arrived on a Tuesday in the second week of May, having ridden from the family homestead in 3 days with the particular determination of a young man who had been given a piece of information that made him feel urgency he couldn't entirely explain. She heard the horse in the yard before she saw him. She came to the kitchen door, and there was her brother, 21 now, a year older than when she'd left, and carrying the year differently than she'd expected. He had the look of someone who had been managing a hard situation alone and had done it imperfectly and learned from the imperfection. His face had sharpened. His eyes had the quality she associated with people who had been through something that cost them. He looked at her. From across the yard, she looked at him. She crossed the yard without hurrying, and she hugged him properly, not the quick version she'd given him when she left, and he held on for longer than she expected, which told her more about the past 6 months than anything he could have said. "You look different," he said when they stepped back. "Good different or bad different?" He considered her for a moment with the serious assessment of a younger brother who has spent his whole life reading his older sister's states. "Settled," he said. "Like you know where you are." "I do," she said. She brought him into the kitchen and made him coffee and food, because that was how she handled people she loved now, not as a performance but as the simplest available form of care. And he sat at the work table and ate and talked. He told her about the homestead. The mortgage was current. Her money had taken it out of crisis, and he'd managed the rest through a combination of work and selling 2 horses they'd been holding on to out of sentiment more than practicality. He'd hired a hand for the spring, a man from the next county who knew cattle and was reliable. The ranch was not thriving, but it was stable, which after the past year felt like an achievement worth naming. "I thought about selling," he said. He said it looking at the table, with the quality of someone confessing something they're not sure about yet, after the bad winter. "I thought maybe the land was just going to keep costing more than it gave back." "Did you?" Mara said. "I didn't," he said, "but I thought about it." He looked up. "Is that wrong?" She thought about it honestly. "No," she said. "Thinking about it isn't the same as doing it, and sometimes you have to think about the worst option to know whether you actually want the other one." Nodded slowly. He looked around the kitchen at the hanging pans, the organized shelves, the recipe tin, and Mei Lin's tin side by side, the county ribbon. He got up and looked at the ribbon more closely. "They made you prove yourself in a cooking competition," he said. The indignation in his voice was fresh, which told her he'd heard the story, but hearing it in person had made it realer. "I chose to do it," she said, "because they put you in a position where you had to." "Yes," she said, "and I won." She looked at him steadily. "Both parts matter, Danny." He looked at the ribbon for another moment. Then he sat back down. "What happened to Mercer, the father?" "He apologized," she said, "in public. Not elaborately, but directly." "And Vivian?" she said. "The cardamom in the tart was the thing that did it. And she was right." Mara picked up her coffee. "I don't think she's a bad person. I think she's a person who was used to getting what she wanted, and had decided that Colton was what she wanted, and she handled it the way people handle, wanting things they're not sure they deserve, by making the competition about their worthiness instead of their ability." Danny looked at her. "That's a generous way to see it." "It's an accurate one," she said. Generous would be forgiving her for what she said to Elsie. He was quiet for a moment. "Have you? I'm working on it," Mara said. Colton came in from the north pasture at noon and found Danny at the work table eating a second plate of biscuits with no apparent shame. He introduced himself the way men of his type introduced themselves briefly, with a handshake that was about information exchange rather than ceremony. Danny looked at him with the assessing eyes of a younger brother, which Colton apparently understood and accepted without making anything of it. They talked while Mara finished the noon meal. She listened while doing 2 other things, which was a skill she'd developed over months of cooking while people talked around her. They talked about the homestead, about cattle prices, about the spring grass, which had come in good this year on both their properties. They talked like men finding the edges of each other, which they were. After the men had been fed and gone back to work and Danny was helping Mara clean up, she'd handed him a rag without asking, and he'd taken it without complaint, which was how they'd always operated, he said quietly. "He looks at you." "What?" "Colton. When he thinks you're not watching." Danny wiped a plate. "He looks at you the way people look at things they're not sure they're allowed to have." Mara said nothing for a moment. She handed him another plate. "He asked me to stay," she said, "after the competition." Danny absorbed this. "And you're staying?" "Yes, because of the job." "Partly," she said, "and partly not." He was quiet for a while. He stacked the plates the way she'd shown him to stack them, years ago in their mother's kitchen, rim to rim, not nested, so the surfaces didn't scratch. He'd remembered, which surprised her. "Are you happy?" he asked, directly, without preamble, the way he sometimes asked things that most people would wrap in softer language. She thought about the word happy. She'd never quite trusted it as a measurement. It was too variable, too dependent on the conditions of any given hour. She thought about what she actually felt when she woke up at 4:15 and went down to the kitchen and started the fire. What she felt when Elsie came to the door at the usual afternoon hour. What she felt when the food was right and the men ate well and the kitchen smelled the way it smelled. "I'm where I'm supposed to be," she said. "That's the closest I know how to get to happy." Danny put down the rag. He looked at her with the expression he'd worn his whole life when he was about to say something he wasn't sure he'd say correctly. "Mara, you left to save the ranch, our ranch." He paused. "I just want to make sure you're not staying here because you forgot to leave." She looked at him. She felt the weight of the question, which was a real question, and deserved a real answer. She thought about the night before the competition, when she'd lain in the dark and known the answer before she had full language for it. She thought about standing in the yard after winning, looking at the ribbon in her hand, and thinking not about the victory, but about the kitchen that was waiting. About Elsie and Mei Lin and the kitchen garden she was planning for summer. I stayed once because I had to, she said. I'm staying now because I chose to. Those are different things. Danny looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded, once, in the way that meant he had decided to take something at face value, because the person saying it had earned that. Okay, he said. Okay, she said. The courtship, if it could be called that, which Mara sometimes privately doubted, was the right word for the particular careful way two people move toward each other, when both of them have been badly burned by loss and are proceeding with the deliberateness of people who understand what the wrong step costs happened across the spring and into the summer, in the spaces between work and meals and the practical demands of a functioning ranch. It was not dramatic. It was not a series of moments that would make sense to anyone watching from outside. It was the accumulation of small things, Colton coming to the kitchen in the evening and sitting at the work table while she finished the last of the cleanup, not always saying much, just being present in the particular way that meant he'd chosen to be there rather than anywhere else. The morning he brought her a second cup of coffee without being asked, because he'd noticed the first one had gone cold while she was dealing with a supply problem. The Sunday afternoon in June when they walked the perimeter of the north pasture for no stated reason, and talked about things that had nothing to do with the ranch, about her parents, about the specific ways that losing people early shapes you in ways you don't always recognize until later. Clara was sick for a long time before she died, he said on that afternoon. Long enough that I'd already started grieving before it ended, which is its own particular thing. He was looking at the fence line, not at her. And then she was gone, and I had Elsie, who was 4 years old, and the ranch, and everything just kept going. The way it does. The way it does, Mara said. I don't know that I processed any of it, he said. I don't know that I've processed it yet. He finally looked at her. Is that a problem? She looked back at him. I don't process things either, she said. I cook them. I work them. I build routines around them and carry them that way. She paused. I think most people don't process things. I think they just keep going until the thing becomes part of how they move. He was quiet for a moment. Is that enough? I don't know, she said. But it's what's available. He looked at her steadily with that look that had become familiar and still somehow landed each time. I don't want to replace something for you, he said. Whatever you came here with your life before, the choices you made because you had to. He paused, finding the words carefully. I don't want you to stay because it's easier than figuring out what comes next. She understood what he was actually asking. He was asking the same thing Danny had asked, from a different direction. Whether she was here because she'd chosen to be here, or because here had become the shape of things, and she'd stopped distinguishing between a shape and a choice. Do you know what I was thinking about, she said, when they said unanimous? He shook his head. The kitchen, she said, coming back to it. The smell of it, specifically 5 months of cooking in a room, does something to the air that I can't entirely describe, but I know exactly what it is. She looked at the pasture. I wasn't thinking about the competition or the result, or Vivian Mercer, or any of it. I was thinking about going home. She let the word sit. That's the first time in my life I've thought of a place other than my parents' house as home. I didn't decide to think it. It just arrived. He said nothing. But something shifted in him, the way things shifted in him when something mattered, not dramatically. Just a slight loosening, a small release. Okay, he said. The same word Danny had used, the right word. They walked back to the ranch in the afternoon light, not touching, not saying much, but with the particular proximity of two people who have decided something without needing to announce it. He asked her properly in August, which she had not expected to happen in August specifically, but which, in retrospect, made sense. August was the month the ranch settled into its midsummer rhythm, the most operational month, the month where you could see clearly what you had and whether it was working. And Colton Vance made decisions in the way a man makes decisions when he has all the information he needs and has finished arguing with himself. He came to the kitchen at 7 in the evening when it was still light outside, which was different from the usual evening visits that happened after dark. He was holding his hat in his hands again. She'd come to understand this told her something. I have something to ask you, he said. I know, she said, because she did. She'd known for a few weeks that it was coming not because of anything he'd said, but because of the way Mei Lin had been slightly more observant than usual during their afternoon sessions. The specific quality of attention of someone who knows something is about to happen and is watching for it. He looked at her steadily. I don't have a speech, he said. I don't do speeches. What I have is... He stopped. Started again. This ranch works because of work, every part of it. The land and the cattle and the hands and the... He stopped again, because he was tangling in it, which almost never happened to him. and it was this tangling that undid her more than anything else he could have done. This carefully controlled man, losing the thread of his own words because the thing he was trying to say mattered too much to come out cleanly. "Colton," she said. He looked at her. "Ask me," she said. "Will you marry me?" he said directly. No ornament. "Yes," she said, the same way. He breathed not with relief exactly, but with the quality of someone who has been holding something carefully and can now set it down. He crossed the kitchen, and he took her hands, which were still flour-dusted from the evening prep, and looked at them for a moment, and then looked at her. "I'll get you a ring," he said, "a proper one." "The flour will ruin it in a week," she said. "Then I'll get you one that can be ruined," he said. "You'll wear it if you want, and not if you don't." She looked at him. She thought about her mother, who had worn her wedding ring through 30 years of kitchen work and ranch work, and every kind of labor a woman's hands get put to, and whose ring by the end of that time had scratches all the way around the band, and a stone that had been reseated twice after being knocked loose. Her mother had considered none of this a problem. "Get me one that can be ruined," she said. He did. It was a simple gold band with a small stone, not elaborate, not cheap, exactly right. They married in October, when the aspen had turned, and the air had the particular clarity of a Colorado fall that knows it's the last good weather for a while and is making the most of it. The ceremony was at the ranch, in the yard, which Mei Lin had spent 2 days making presentable in her particular way, practical and without fuss, which meant it looked exactly right. Danny came from the homestead. He'd put on his good jacket and cleaned his boots, and looked like the version of himself that their mother had been raising him toward, not quite there yet, still young, still carrying the slight tentativeness of a person figuring out who they're going to be, but recognizably headed somewhere good. Pete was there, and Otis, and the hands who'd been on the ranch long enough to feel some ownership of the occasion. The new men there had been turnover in the spring. 2 departures and 3 new arrivals watched from a respectful distance, with the careful attention of people still learning the landscape. Mei Lin wore a coat Mara had never seen before, dark green with buttons that appeared to be actual jade, which she said nothing about and which Mara noted and also said nothing about. Elsie wore the dress Mara and Mei Lin had made for her together on 3 evenings in September, not elaborate, because Elsie had opinions about elaborate, and they were negative, but good fabric and good stitching, and a color that worked with Elsie's coloring, which was her mother's coloring, and therefore worth attention. She wore it with the dignity of someone who understands that an occasion is being marked and has decided to honor the marking. She stood beside Mara. Not behind, not to the side in the way of children who are peripheral to adult ceremonies. Beside her. Mara had asked her, one afternoon in the kitchen when they were doing the braided rolls that Elsie had long since mastered, and sometimes made largely alone while Mara supervised other things. She'd asked quietly, without ceremony, because ceremony was not the mode that worked with Elsie. "I'd like you to stand beside me," she'd said, "if you want to." Elsie had been working the dough. She'd looked at Mara for a moment with those old eyes. "Okay," she'd said, and gone back to the dough. On the day she stood exactly as she'd said she would, straight-backed, serious, wearing her good dress, holding herself the way she'd learned to hold herself with the composed dignity of a child who had lost a great deal, and found, slowly and imperfectly, that the world had not finished giving her things. The person who married them was the county judge, who knew Colton and was brief and direct, which was the right choice. The words were plain, the vows were plain. Mara held Colton's hands, which were calloused and large and warm, and said what needed to be said, and he said it back, and it was done. There was food after the best meal Mara had made since coming to Blackthorn, which was saying something, planned over 2 weeks and executed over 2 days, with Mei Lin alongside, and Elsie underfoot, and Pete hauling things from the cold room without being asked, because he'd learned how the kitchen operated and had decided he was part of it. Danny ate 3 plates. He looked at the ring on Mara's hand when he thought she wasn't watching, and she caught him at it, and he looked immediately elsewhere, with the expression of someone pretending they hadn't been doing what they'd been doing. "Say it," she said. "Mama would have liked this," he said, quietly. Not sentimentally, just accurately, the way he sometimes made accurate observations that cut straight to the thing. Mara looked at the yard, the people, the light, the food on the tables, the ranch buildings standing in the fall afternoon. Yes, she said, she would have. The year turned. Then another one. Life at Blackthorn Ranch did not become easy. It was a working ranch, which meant it was never without its problems, its failed seasons and sick cattle and equipment that broke at the wrong time and conflicts between men that required management. Mara cooked through all of it. The rhythm of the kitchen continued 4:15 wake-ups, breakfast at 5 noon meal, supper, the afternoon hours for other work. She expanded what she did. She managed the kitchen garden through spring and summer, put up preserves in late summer and fall, taught the new hands how to manage a kitchen fire properly, because two of them had grown up in circumstances where this was not a skill anyone had passed along. She and Colton were not always easy with each other. Marriage did not resolve the ways in which they were different people, his stillness against her activity, his tendency to process everything internally, against her tendency to work things out in motion. They had disagreements that were real disagreements, not the kind that resolve in an hour, and they navigated these with the imperfect, sometimes grinding work of two people who are committed to the navigation, even when it's not going well. There was a winter, the second winter of the marriage, when things between them went quiet, in a way that was not comfortable quiet, but the kind of quiet that builds when people are avoiding something they need to say. It lasted 6 weeks. Mara cooked through it. Colton worked through it. Eventually, on a Sunday evening when the ranch was settled and Elsie was asleep and the house was still, Colton came into the kitchen and sat down and said, "I've been afraid." "Of what?" she said. "That you'd leave," he said. Simply. Not deliberately. But that eventually you'd understand you could. He looked at his hands. That one day you'd look at the life you chose when you didn't have choices and want the life you might choose now that you do. She looked at him. She thought about the day she'd walked into this kitchen for the first time with a failing stove and no flour and 22 men who expected breakfast in 45 minutes. She thought about what she'd had then: debt, obligation, her mother's recipe tin, and her own knives, and the specific determination of someone who had come too far to consider going back. "I could leave," she said. "You're right that I could. The debts are paid. Danny is managing. I have skills that would take me somewhere else if I decided to go." She held his gaze. "I'm not going. Not because I can't, but because this is where I want to be." "That hasn't changed," she paused. "But you're going to have to keep believing that. I can't prove it in advance." He was quiet for a long moment. "No," he said. "That's fair." He looked at her. "I'm sorry I went quiet." "I know," she said. "I know why you did it." They sat in the kitchen for a while longer, not resolving anything with drama or resolution, just sitting in the same room and being two people who had chosen each other and were still imperfectly choosing. Elsie called her Ma for the first time in the spring of the second year, and it was not a moment Mara had been waiting for or would have asked for, because it was not the kind of thing you ask for. It happened in the kitchen on a Thursday afternoon, the usual time, Elsie on her stool. She was 10 now nearly, and had grown in the way of children who grow all at once, and then stop for a while, and then go again. And she was in a grown phase, her face sharpening toward the one she would eventually carry into adulthood. She was making the braided rolls largely without instruction, the way she'd been doing for a year, her hands doing the work that had been placed in them through enough repetition to become automatic. She finished the braid and put it on the pan and looked at it critically. "The left end is tight," she said. "Yes," Mara said. "Do you know why?" I started pulling toward myself on the last 2 crosses instead of straight down. She looked at it. "Does it matter?" "Will it bake the same?" "It'll bake fine," Mara said. "The form will be slightly uneven." Elsie considered this with the focus she brought to evaluating her own work, which was never falsely modest and never self-congratulatory, just accurate. "I'll fix it on the next one," she said. She picked up a fresh piece of dough. Then, without any particular ceremony, without looking up, "Ma, what's the point of the form if the taste is the same?" The kitchen did not go still in a dramatic way. The stove made its usual sound. The afternoon light was where it always was at this hour. Mara stood at the work table and felt the word land in her chest and take up space there, and she did not make a thing of it, because making a thing of it would have been wrong. "The form is for you," she said. "The taste is for everyone else." Elsie thought about this. "That seems backwards," she said. "Most things that matter are," Mara said. Elsie worked through the second braid, adjusting for the error. The form came out even. She put it beside the first one and looked at them both. "Better," she said, with the satisfaction of someone who has diagnosed a problem and solved it and moved on. Mara looked at the 2 braids side by side, the uneven one and the corrected one, and thought about all the things she would have said to her own mother if her mother had lived long enough to hear them, and could not say now, and had to carry forward instead in the way she cooked, and the way she taught, and the way she stood in a kitchen at 4:15 in the morning and lit the fire and began. Years went on the way years go, not smoothly, not dramatically, but with the textured reality of actual time, which contains everything in no particular order, good harvests and bad ones. The slow improvement of the bunkhouse after Pete, who had turned out to be quietly handy in ways nobody had initially known, proposed and executed a series of repairs that made the place habitable in a way it hadn't been before. Mei Lin's health, which remained good until it didn't, and the months when Mara took over more of the main house and Mei Lin sat in the kitchen instead of cooking in it, which they both managed with the specific grace of women who understand that roles are not identities. Danny visited twice a year, regular as the seasons. He married a woman named Harriet in the 4th year practical, direct. with opinions about cattle management that Danny's described as occasionally confrontational, and which Mara, upon meeting her, recognized immediately as simply correct. She liked Harriet from the first afternoon. Harriet ate Mara's apple tart and said, "What's in this?" And when Mara told her, she nodded once and asked for the recipe, which Mara gave her. The recipe went out of the tin for the first time. It seemed right. Elsie grew up. This happened with the relentlessness that children grow up, regardless of whether the adults around them are ready. She was 12, then 14, then 16, and opinionated and occasionally difficult and entirely herself the careful, old-eyed child having become a careful, sharp-minded young woman with clear views on what she was and was not willing to accept from the world, which Mara considered the best possible outcome and said so when Elsie was 17 and frustrated with something she'd been told she couldn't do. "You're angry because you know you're capable of more than they're giving you credit for," Mara said. "Yes," Elsie said. "Good," Mara said. "Stay angry about that. Not at yourself and not at them specifically. Just keep knowing what you can do." Elsie looked at her. She had Clara's coloring in Colton's eyes and something that was entirely her own, an intelligence that had been shaped by loss and kitchen afternoons, and a woman who had come to Blackthorn Ranch with a tin recipe box and her mother's apron and had stayed. "Is that what you did?" Elsie asked. Mara thought about a yard in December with 3 armed men and a woman in an expensive coat, and the word "I accept" coming out of her mouth before she'd had time to think better of it. "More or less," she said. "There is a thing that happens in kitchens. If you spend enough years in them, that has nothing to do with technique or recipe. It has to do with the accumulation of time in a space, all the hours of heat and work, and the people who came through it, and what they needed from it. A kitchen that has been used seriously over a long enough period, by someone who understood that feeding people is not a small act, develops a quality that is almost atmospheric. You feel it when you walk in. It's not something you can describe to someone who hasn't experienced it." Mara had felt it in her mother's kitchen. She had built it over years in this one. On the morning that became, without her planning it, the morning she told Elsie the thing she most wanted to pass along. It was early October. The aspen had turned again, which they did every year with a reliability that felt generous, given how many other things were not reliable. Elsie was 18. She was leaving in 2 weeks for a situation in Dalton, an apprenticeship with a woman who ran a proper bakery, which had been arranged through a combination of Mara's connection from the competition and Elsie's own stubbornness in pursuing it. She was in the kitchen at the usual time, on the usual stool. She was not making anything. She was just sitting, the way she sometimes sat when she had something she was moving around in her head. "Are you afraid?" Mara asked. "Of leaving? Of all of it? Of it being harder than you thought?" Elsie was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said, directly the way she answered most things. "Are you allowed to be afraid and still go?" Mara looked at the shelf. The recipe tin, its latch still slightly stuck, and Mei Lin's tin beside it, and the county ribbon that had been there so long it had become simply part of what the shelf held, as unremarkable and permanent as the pans. She looked at these things that were the physical record of what she'd built here, in this room, in this life. "That's the only way anyone ever goes anywhere," she said. "Afraid and still going." Elsie looked at the shelf too, at the tins, at the ribbon, at her own hands in her lap, which were her mother's hands and her father's hands, and also completely her own. "Ma," she said. "Yeah, thank you for letting me in the kitchen." Mara looked at her. This girl who had come to the kitchen door at 8 years old with her hair in a careful braid, and her dress 2 seasons short, and those old eyes, deciding. This girl who had taught her cardamom without knowing she was teaching it, who had stood beside her in October light and let herself be known. "You came in yourself," Mara said. "I just didn't close the door." There was something Mara understood, in the years that followed, in the particular ongoing education of a life that keeps going past the point where you expected it to resolve, about the kind of thing her mother had tried to tell her in the kitchen, years and years before, when she was 9 or 10, and the instruction had seemed like it was about bread. Her mother had said, "You can overwork a recipe, the same way you can overwork a life. You keep adjusting, keep adding, keep trying to fix it into something better than it is, and what you lose is the thing that was already there, the quality that was only available if you let it be what it was." Mara had spent a long time not understanding this. She'd understood the bread part. She'd known since she was 12 that an overworked dough had a specific quality, dense and resistant, all the air worked out of it. She'd known you had to stop at a certain point and let the dough be, let it rest, let it become what the yeast was trying to make of it. She had not understood until much later that this was also the instruction for the rest of it, the knowing when to stop adjusting, the trusting that what you'd built, what you'd made from what you had, in the circumstances you'd found yourself in, with the people who'd come through the door, was enough, was actually the thing, not the placeholder for something better. She had arrived at Blackthorn Ranch with debt and grief, and her mother's recipe tin, and the particular determination of someone with nowhere to retreat. She had made breakfast for 22 men in a kitchen that needed work, and she had kept doing it, and she had stopped running the internal calculation that told her she was temporary. She had let herself rise. It had not been smooth. It had not been the story anyone who met her in that yard in September would have predicted. It had been imperfect and difficult, and occasionally more than she thought she could manage, and she had managed it anyway, not because she was extraordinary, but because she showed up every morning and did the work, and trusted that the work was enough. This is what she knew in the end. Not as a lesson she could hand to Elsie fully formed, or Danny, or anyone else who was standing where she'd stood, at the beginning of something hard with no guarantee of how it came out, but as a thing she'd come to through living it, which is the only way you come to anything that's actually true. You do the work. You stop when you've done what it needs. You let it rest. You trust the rising. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, enough what comes out of the oven is exactly what the thing was supposed to be.